And folks, if you're joining us for the first time, you're very welcome here. This is the Apologetics Academy, which we run every Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, or Greenwich Mean Time, which translates as 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, and 12 noon Pacific. Or if you're in Central Europe, it's 9 p.m. Or indeed in South Africa, also 9 p.m. And we bring in, the idea is to bring in different scholars and speakers and apologists, debaters, and people representing different flavors across the theological and philosophical spectrum. We often bring in Christians, and we also often bring in atheists, and we sometimes even bring in Muslim scholars and apologists to talk to us about a subject of interest to Christians, and in particular in relation to whether Christianity is true, and we also critically examine and investigate other worldviews and religions. And so we've had the likes of Matt Dillahunty on, for example, representing atheism. We've had David Fitzgerald on representing atheism, and other atheists as well. We have atheists lined up in the future as well, such as Robert Price. We've had Yusuf Ismail, the Muslim apologist, on a few times, and we've had a lot of Christians on as well. So this evening we have Jay Smith, who is based in the UK, here in London at the moment, although he's going to be moving back to the States sometime soon. And he is involved, he runs an organization down in London called Fander Apologetics, which is specifically geared towards addressing and tackling Islam, the Islamic religion, and witnessing to Muslims. So we're going to be having an Islamic-themed discussion today. Whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or neither, you're very welcome to attend and ask questions. As I was saying a minute ago, there's a number of ways that you can participate in the webinar. After Jay has talked, then I will give an opportunity for people to raise hand. There's a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, along where the options are. And if you click raise hand, then I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Jay and go back and forth in dialogue with him for a period of time, and then we'll switch to someone else. And so that's the way we try to do the Q&A session. You can also submit questions anonymously if you prefer to do it that way. You can click the Q&A button and submit questions that way, or you can participate in the chat, or you can simply watch and listen anonymously and enjoy the show. Do you want to maybe go ahead, Jay, and maybe you can introduce yourself further if you want, or just launch into your presentation?
Good. Okay. No, can you hear me all right now?
We can hear you. If people, the folks here, Jay, okay? If you do, just indicate so in the chat.
Okay. If not, just tell me, and I'll stop and try to speak louder. I don't know how to get it any louder than what it is.
That's okay.
Probably the laptop. But my name is Jay Smith. I've been working with Muslims for about 33 years, maybe 34 years now, and one of the areas that has been exciting to me has been this whole historical critique that's been coming down the pike. I first got involved in this in 1994 when I took a class here in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies from Dr. Gerald Hotting. And back at that time, he was teaching this material, using an awful lot of different people. He was using people like Dr. Patricia Corona, Dr. Wansborough, others that he introduced in the class. And at that time, I never heard this material before. I've not come across this in America. When I studied at Fuller Seminary, I'd never heard this material concerning how Islam began. So I've had it now. I've been going and working on it now for over 20 years. And that's why I want to introduce it tonight, because some new material has been coming to light. And this is one of the great things about the whole historical critique. It keeps engaging with new material. So you have to keep up with the newest research to keep on top of it. Back in 1994, when I first came across it, I took this down to Speaker's Corner in the fall of 1994. And in the spring of 1995, it caused such a furore at Speaker's Corner because many of the Muslims had themselves, like myself, had never come across it. So they asked me to do a debate. I had never done debates before. I was not trained as a debater. I'm an apologist and a polemicist, but not a debater. And so at that time, I said I was reticent to do so. But in August of I was with Dr. Jamal Badawi, and at that time I was studying, and I had as my supervisor Dr. Dr. Patricia Kroner, who had moved to Cambridge University. And so I went to her and I took about 10 historical challenges. So we're talking about 22 years ago. I took 10 historical challenges that she gave me, and others as well, but she was the one that said, do this, do this, do this, do this. And I remember going through these material, and I asked Dr. Jamal Badawi, considered to be one of the world's authority, in 1994 on the Quran. And I gave these challenges to him that night at Cambridge University, Trinity College. And that's where this thing just blew open. And that's where we started our debate site. We put that material on the debate site because Dr. Badawi did not have answers to these historical challenges. He had answers to other challenges, but not these. And that's when I realized that we have got something here that Muslims need to hear and that Muslims need to work on and they need to digest. So what I want to do tonight is I want to go through these challenges, but I add new material that's come to light in the last 22 years, and specifically material that's come together in the last, 2 to 3, actually the last 5 years. Since 2011. So let's go get right into it and let's move right ahead. Now, what do Muslims claim? Well, they all claim that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, that the Quran is his final revelation sent down to him. And therefore, Islam is the final religion based on not only what Muhammad said and did, but also on the Quran's teaching. So every Muslim is dependent on these two pillars, you might say, Muhammad and the Quran, the book of the man, the book of the man. And I love saying that. That's one of my favorite sayings. It's all based on the book of the man, which I get excited about because Christianity is also based on another book and another man. So we both start from the same paradigm. Both Christians and Muslims start from the idea of going back to a book for our authority based on the model of a man. And that's why I'm bringing this material tonight, because it's important for that. And what we now know about the man himself, Muhammad, we have been told, and this is what we're all told, that he was born in 570, that he met Jibril or Gabriel in the Hira cave there in around 610, and then from that time when he was told to recite, he said, I could not recite. But he was then given the revelations of what we know as the Meccan revelations from 610 to 622, the latter part of the Quran, the second half of the Quran, by rule of thumb. And then in 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night, was told to get on the back of the Burak, the winged horse, flew up to Mecca, and from Mecca he went to the 7 heavens, met Allah, who told him to pray 5 times a day, came down to the 5th heaven. Moses asked him, how many times are you to pray? He said 50, and so he brings it down, goes back and forth, bouncing back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven till it gets down to 5 prayers. That we know is the Miraj. So that happens in 621. In 622, then he moves up, he called the Hijrah, that's the Exodus from Mecca to Medina, with possibly 80 to possibly 200. It depends on which tradition you're going to read. And then in 622, he then started receiving the Medinan revelations. That's the first part of the Quran. I'm sure most of you know what I'm saying because this is not new to most of you who are listening. But this is the story that we have been given. And then in 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, those Medinan revelations were then revealed while he was there in Medina. In 630, he conquered Mecca peacefully. In 632, he then died, possibly by poison. We don't know. But at that time, the Quran had not been written down. That's what we're told. So in 632, there was no Quran. And I'm just giving you the bare bones. I'm not giving you the a much more intrinsic account, because this is just the bare bones, just to give us something to hold on to, something to go by, something to then critique. Now, we do know that Abu Bakr then takes over for the next 2 years, up to 634. He dies peacefully. Umar then takes over for the next 4 years, up to 644. He is violently killed. Uthman then takes over, is the third rightly guided caliph from 644 to 656. It's during his time, during his reign, that the Quran is then finally written down in its canonized form. Then he is killed in 656, and Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, supposedly the rightful heir to Muhammad, according to the Shiites. Then he takes over, and he is killed in 661 at the Battle of Siffin with Muawiyah. So that's the classical account. I don't know if we've heard any other account. That's what I've been taught since I was knee-high to the gospel, to a grasshopper, knee-high to a grasshopper. That's what I think everybody listening has been told. This is the narrative that we've all been told. And there's been no reason to question this narrative. It's the classical account. Why question it? It's what we've all been taught in our schools. It's what I was taught in seminary. It's what I was taught in university. It's what still you will find all over the world today. Now, here's the problem. When you look at everything I've just said in the last 5 minutes, when I've looked at that narrative in the last slide, it all takes place in that red area from 570 to 632. Now, when was all this material written down? Well, you would hope that it would be written down by people that either knew Muhammad, were there alongside him, certainly those who were eyewitnesses to this, but that's not the case. It's not written down at all by anybody that knew him. We don't know of anybody in the 7th century at all that wrote this narrative, this story, this classical account that I've just gone through about who Muhammad was, what he did, what he said, and of course, how Islam began. No, that's not written down in the 7th century. In fact, it first gets written down in the form that we have today, in extant material that we have today by Ibn Hisham. He gets much of his material from Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq dies in 765 AD, but we don't really have Ibn Ishaq's material. We're dependent on Ibn Hisham. He throws away anything he doesn't like and only retains what he feels is legitimate of the Siratu Rasulullah, which would be the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. The Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, these are not written down until, in its form that we can use today, until Al-Bukhari, who dies in 870. So look at the red area on the left. That's all the stories about what Muhammad said and what Muhammad did, how Islam began, the whole historical narrative on how Islam began. It doesn't get written down in its final form until the form that we have today, that we have access to, until Ibn Hisham in 833, 200 years later, Al-Bukhari in 870, that's 240 years later, and then the tafsir and the tahriq are the other two genres, the commentaries on the Quran, and the tahriq, which would be the histories of mankind. That's not put together until the 10th century. Al-Tabari is the first one to write, is the one who we use today as the original, the one who then writes down the material that is used today. Now that's, if you see the problem right there, you can see what I'm getting at. If everything we know about who Muhammad was, what he said, how Islam began, where he lived, what he did when he lived there, how the Quran was put together, even if the Quran was put together, if that doesn't come together until the 9th and 10th century, 200 to 300 years later, should we trust it? And where did Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, all of these, where did these guys get their material from? They weren't eyewitnesses to any of this material. They were not even living in the same century. They were living 2 centuries later and later. And they were not living in the same area that Muhammad lived. They did not live in Arabia. They were all living much, much further away. Just look at Jesus. When I look at the person of Jesus, look at see if he is historical. We know that he dies in 33 AD. Now, there will be dispute even amongst those of us who are watching here who will dispute my figures on this. That's fine. When we ask, what did he say and what did he do? Where do we get our material on what he did and he said? We know that Paul's letters were written between 48 and 64 AD. So within 15 to 20 years of Christ's death, you see Paul's letters getting written down. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 3 of the Gospels are written within 20 to 25 years, some possibly 30 years after Christ's death. Some may push it later. Acts was written between 52 and 62 AD. That's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. The Gospel of John would have been written the latest. I put it at around 90, late 1st century, probably not written by him, probably by a scribe of his. Nonetheless, everything we know about what Jesus said and what he did is written within 15 to 60 years of his death. Compare that with what we know what Muhammad did and said, and you get 200 to 300 years. If you do a comparison, if we were to depend on what we know of Jesus for what Muslims know about their prophet Muhammad and what they know about what he said and did, we'd have to wait to the 3rd century to know anything about Jesus Christ. So you can see why we're bringing this to the fore and why we're asking these questions. So the scholars are critical, and there are today in the 21st century, the scholars have this problem. Islam, as we know it, they say, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Conclusion, the history of Islam that I'm going to talk about tonight, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, 685 to 705, and before, is possibly a later fabrication. And that's the conclusion that I'm going to start with. Now I've got to prove it. And let's do that right now. Now, what are their concerns? And this is why they're making coming to those conclusions. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, first of all, why did it take so long to write it down? Were these people not literate? Remember, by the time of the end of the 7th century, well, even by 642, within 10 years of Muhammad's death, they had already conquered Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, the 5 great cities of the Levant. Then by the time 685, they controlled all of the land from Spain in the west to India in the east. That whole swath of land was under their control. Are we saying, therefore, that nobody could read or write in that whole swath of land? And certainly, could anybody not read or write in Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo? And of course, the answer is absolutely they could write. There would be no notion that they could not write it down. So why didn't they write it down? Why didn't they write down this story about this man, about that book, about this religion? Why did they not write it down immediately if it was that important? And it would be important because this is the greatest man, according to Islam, in the history of mankind. It's not till the 9th century that the biographers finally get it written down in a form that we can use today. So if it's written so late, can we trust it if it is so late? Shouldn't we go back to those events that took place? Shouldn't we go back to the 7th century and see what we find? And what are we finding? Now remember, let's just take a look at a map. You'll see what I'm talking about. That dark brown area and the red area is what the Arabs control. Now, you notice I'm using the word Arab for a very good reason, because that's what we do know. We do know that the Arabs did control that part of the land up until 661. So it's a big area of land. That's you have Aden, you have Mecca, you have Medina, Basra, Baghdad, Jerusalem, you have Cairo, you have Damascus. All this is under the control. These are big, sophisticated, cosmopolitan cities. Certainly people could read and write in these cities. Now, let's look and see who are the scholars that we're going to use today. And the ones I'm going to use today are the revisionist scholars, people like Dr. John Wansborough, head of School of Quranic Studies there at School of Oriental and African Studies, wrote Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu in the late 1970s. And those 2 books are what blew open this whole discussion. Dr. Gerald Haunting was my supervisor at School of Oriental and African Studies when I was coming across this and working on it in 1994. He's probably the authority on the 1st century of Islam. Dr. Patricia Corona was my supervisor when I was also although she was up in Cambridge, I was here in London. And she now then moved to Princeton, where she has just died last year. So she's just recently deceased. She was the one that really confronted the whole idea of Mecca. What do we know about this city, Mecca? In a book that she wrote in 1987 called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. This woman could read and write 15 languages, all archaic languages. So we're talking about one of the top people in the world when it comes to linguistics. And that's why she's so dangerous, because she goes to the original sources when she does her research, Dr. Andrew Rippin out of Calgary, Muslims, Their Practices and Beliefs, is the one that probably takes this material and puts it down into layman's terminology. If you really want to find out what this is all about, read his book. Dr. Robert Hoyland out of Oxford. Back then when I knew him, he was at Oxford. He's now moved from there since then. He wrote the book Seeing Islam as Others See It. He reads and writes, I understand, I've been told that he reads and writes 18 languages. Again, like Patricia Crone. These are linguists, and that's why they're so important, because they go back to the original tongue. They go back to the original text, and that's why they can say the things they're saying. Dr. Yehuda Nebo out of the University of Jerusalem, writing on the Crossroads to Islam. He's the one that has done the best work on the earliest Arab inscriptions, which have really opened up on what exactly was happening in the early inscriptions, how the Arabic changed, but also who the first Umayyads were, what they were saying, what they knew about this man Muhammad, and what they knew about the Islam as we know it. And then from the German school, the ones coming out of Germany who've probably done the best work on the manuscripts, Dr. Gunther Luning, Dr. Gerd Twin, Dr. von Boltmore, and Dr. Oleg. These are the ones who have looked at the Sana manuscript. Dr. Gunther Luning has probably done some of the best work on Syriac letters and Syriac poetry. That has been exciting to see his material. He's no longer living. He's now deceased. But there have been 2 books and then 1 documentary, which I would like to introduce to this group tonight. And these are the 2 books that have come out in the last 5 years. Dr. Tom Holland in 2012. In the Shadow of the Sword. Now that's become a bestseller here in Britain. When he came out with that, he was asking questions that should have been asked many, many years before. And the reason why people like Dr. Tom Holland is because he takes very difficult ideas and brings them down to layman's terminology. So people like us can understand what exactly is happening. These are difficult material to work with. He had brought it down so that we can understand it. And that's why when he put it together, his documentary in August 28th of 2012 called Islam, the Untold Story, It's only 90 minutes long, summarizes much of what he wrote in his book, but doesn't really come to any real conclusions. That caused such a fury here that when they wanted to rebroadcast it in November of 2012 on Channel 4, because of the fury of the Muslims here in Britain, they did not broadcast it a second time, which is unfortunate. However, you can get it. If you live in Britain, you can get it. I don't know if you can outside of Britain. You can go onto the Channel 4 archives and just pull it off. Take a look at it. It's well worth what you need to see. But probably the best work that I have seen that's come across down the pike is this man's work, Dr. Dan Gibson, or Dan Gibson. I don't think he does have a doctorate. Quranic Geography is the book that came out in 2011. And then just a month ago, The Sacred City. You need to go and watch that documentary. It's brand new. It's just come out. Much of the material that I'm going to be using tonight comes from that documentary. What he has done, he's expanded on what he wrote in 2011, and he's put it into a much better formulated and also worked through and understood a documentary that actually you can vividly see. You have to buy it. It's not free. Nonetheless, go online, buy it, get it tonight, and look at it. It's only an hour and 25 minutes long. And he asks the question of, where did Islam actually begin? Was Mecca the original city? And much of it faces and delves into the whole problem of Mecca. Did the Qibla originally face Mecca? And then points to geographical incongruities there in the Quran. Now, what are they finding? This is what they're finding about early Islam. What they're saying is that the very first Arab inscriptions referencing Muhammad, these are Arab inscriptions. There have been extra Arabic inscriptions outside of Arab area that do refer to him by name. But Arab inscriptions, the first one we know of, is not till 691, yet he died in 632. The first reference to Muslims is also in the 690s. So what did they call themselves? Who were these people that were taking over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo? They did call themselves. They called themselves Sabbasids. That was the name for the Arabs at that time. Hagarenes, they were in the line of Hagar. Ishmaelites, they were in the line of Ishmael. Maghrebis, because they come from the Maghreb. Muhajirun, which means people who are in exodus, people who are moving from one place to another. So they do refer to themselves. They do keep a history of what they're doing, but they don't call themselves Muslims. That's what's curious. Yet these should be the first Muslims. Up until the 690s, we're talking about for the first 60 years after Muhammad's death, these people do not refer to themselves as the way we should. The first reference to the name Islam is not to the Dome of the Rock, built in 691. And the first reference to Mecca, this is the most disturbing. The first reference to the city called Mecca is not till 741. Now that's over a century after the time that Muhammad died. As I've already said, the first biography of Muhammad himself within Islamic sources is not till 833, 200 years after the fact. Now let's look at some of the problems here. And let's start with geography. Let's start with Dan Gibson. Let's look at his book from 2011. And he looks at the Quran. When you look at the Quran, you will see that there are about 65 geographical references in the Quran. Only 9 places are named. The people of Ad are referred to 23 times. These would be the biblical Uz. The people of Thamud are referred to 24 times. These would be the name for the Nabateans. They were the ones that cut dwellings into mountains. The people of Midian are referred to 7 times in the Quran. These would be the Midianites, in the biblical Midianites. Now, it's important to say this because if you have this prophet, remember the prophet that's in the Quran, you only find his name 4 times, but it's referred to this prophet over and over again and refers to the place where the prophet came from, but doesn't give it a name. Nonetheless, this prophet in the Quran has contact over and over again with people from Ad 23 times, Thamud 24 times, and Midian 7 times, which suggests that he lives very close to these peoples. But take a look on the map and see where the people of Ad, Thamud, and Midian live. They don't live anywhere near Mecca, way down in the south. If Muhammad is living in Mecca, he's 600 miles too far south. There's no way you can have daily contact with people 600 miles away, unless, of course, you fly up there. They didn't have planes at that time. So there's no way that anybody could have had that kind of contact that's referred to over and over and over again in the Quran with people that far north. The Quran has 65 geographical references. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, has 110 geographical references. When you look at the 9 places names in the Quran, compare it with 31 place names in the Gospel of Luke. And when you look at the references to those places, you will find they're 600 miles too far north. We're going to explain that a little bit more. Yet when you look at the Gospel of Luke, you will see that all the places in the Gospel of Luke are in the right place. We don't have this problem with the Gospel of Luke, which is the most historical, probably the best reused because of all the names, dates, and places that are referred in that Gospel. So geographical problems, the next problem is Mecca itself. Now, what do we know about Mecca? There's only one verse in the Quran that speaks about Mecca. That's Mecca. That's Surah 48, verse 24. It says it's in a valley. That's all we really know. It doesn't really give us where it is. It doesn't give us much more. And though there are many references in the Quran about the place of the prophet, the settlement of the prophet, it doesn't give it a name. It just refers to the place where the prophet comes from, which is fascinating, because if this is all about Muhammad and Mecca, then why doesn't it give a name? And why, when it does, it's only once. There's also reference to Bakka, Surah 3, Ayah 96. Could that be Mecca? Now, what we do know from many of the traditions, Al-Buhari and also from Tirmidhi and Tabari and other sources, is that this place where the prophet lives, the place of the prophet, is in a valley. It has a parallel valley. It has a stream going through it. It has a pillar of salt from which the prophet goes past in the morning and comes back in the night. So it's right very close to where he lives. It has fields. It has tree, grass, fruit, loam. It has olive trees. That's interesting. And then it has a mountain overlooking the Kaaba. So it does refer to a Kaaba. There is a Kaaba there in this place where this prophet comes from. Yet when you look at Mecca, even today, you will see it's not in a valley. It has none of these listed above because it is much too arid and much too dry. Now, according to Islam, what do we know? Well, according to what we know in Islam, we will know that Mecca is the center of Islam. It's the center of history. Some traditions refer to the fact that in Surah 3, Ayah 96, it is the first sanctuary appointed for mankind was that at Bakka. It's the mother of all settlements, according to Surah 692 and Surah 42, Ayah 5. It is possibly where Adam and Eve were thrown down to. We know they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which is up in space, in Surah 7, Ayah 24. They're thrown down. According to some references, that was Mecca that they were thrown down to. What we do know is that in 1900 BC, when Abraham was living, and he did live in 1900 BC, he was certainly there because that's in Surah 21, Ayah 51 to 71. I had no idea Abraham lived in Mecca, but according to the Quran, he was there in 1900 BC. So it's a pretty old city. It should be well known. It was where Muhammad was born and lived, according to what the traditions tell us. Possibly moved there from there in 622, and it became the center of the Qibla in 624. We see that in Surah 2, Ayah 145 to 150. Yet there's only one reference to Mecca in the Quran. Why is it so little said about it if it's that important? If it possibly is the oldest city in the history of mankind, if it's where Abraham comes from, it's where Muhammad grew up, if it's the center of the whole universe, then why is so little said about it? Now take a look at a Byzantine map from that time period. This is from the 7th century, and you notice what's missing. You can go also to another map, a trade route map from the 7th century, and you can see what else is missing. When we look at 6th century map, Mecca does not exist. There is no Mecca on that map. Here's a 7th century map. You can see Mecca is not on that map either. That's of the whole Arabian Peninsula. Mecca is missing out of these 7th century maps. There's another 7th century map. And this is the problem. We can't find Mecca on any map. From the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. We can't find Mecca on any map at any of the centuries. Now, when Dr. Patricia Corona looked at this map, she was looking at this map and she noticed a problem here. This is the one that is supposedly was compiled or put together by people today looking back on the 7th century as to what Mecca, what would look like back in the 7th century. And if you notice, they put Mecca there on the map because they assumed that it was there at that time. But when she looked at it carefully, she noticed there was a problem because we'd always known that the trade route theory by Montgomery Watt suggests that all the trade coming from India over the east and also from China further east had to go across the Arabian Sea over up the Persian Gulf to get over to the Mediterranean. You can see it on the map in front of you. That's called the trade route theory. But that's not the whole trade route theory. Montgomery Watt then said that in the 5th and the 6th century, the Byzantines up in the north were warring with the Persians here right in the center of the map, which is where Iran is today. They were called the Sassanids. So the Sassanids and the Byzantines were warring back and forth with each other for about 200 years. So that shut down the trade out of the Persian Gulf. That trade had to be redirected, and it came down to Aden, right down here in the south. You can see it right there at the tip, near the tip of Yemen. And from there, it went 1,250 miles up the Western Plateau, up through Najran, Sana, up to Taif, supposedly down to Mecca, up to Yathrib, up to Khaybar, Tabuk, and then on up to Gaza in the north. That's known as the trade route theory. I was taught that when I was in seminary. That's what everybody has been taught, that that's how Mecca became important, because it was the center of trade from Aden to Gaza, and it controlled the trade from Aden to Gaza. She said, hold on a minute, take a look at this map. You've got a problem here. Now, my 10-year-old son noticed immediately when I asked him, does that make sense to you? And he said, Daddy, hold on a minute. Why would they take all the goods off there in Aden and go overland 1,250 miles when they have a waterway going up the west coast, the Red Sea? Why didn't they keep it on board ship? He knew as well as Dr. Patricia Krohn that when you take a ton of goods and you just go 50 miles by land, it would be the same price as going 1,250 miles by sea. You always take goods by sea. It's the cheapest way to send anything. Even today, we do ply the oceans because it is by far the cheapest way to take lots of goods. And so that's why he asked me that when he was just 10 years old. And you can see the problem. She saw the problem right away. Does not make sense to take it off and go 1,250 miles overland. And then she noticed, if you take a close look, you will see that Mecca is not on the trade route. Follow the green line. And you will see it comes off the Western Plateau, comes down about 1,000 meters, down to Mecca, then has to get back up and go 1,000 meters up to Yathrib. From Taif down to Mecca, then up to Yathrib. She said, why would they go off the trade route? Why would they come down to Mecca? Why would they get off that route? And so she decided to write a book in the 1980s and was published in 1987 called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. And she found out that, now remember, she reads and writes 15 languages, so she could go back to the original sources from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, all the way up into the 8th century. And she could not find any reference to Mecca at all. She went to the trading documents. She went to the Sassanid documents in Ctesiphon, when they controlled Ctesiphon, what is now today Baghdad. They would come down to Yathrib, which you can see on the map there. Yathrib had silver. They had silver mines there. So they're very just northeast of Mecca. There's no reference in any of their documents about a place called Mecca, though they do refer to Yathrib further south and to Khaybar further north. So she couldn't find any reference to this place called Mecca. Then she looked at all the supposed 15 trade spices that were traded at that time, and she couldn't find any reference except for two spices that were traded in the southern part of Saudi Arabia in what is today Yemen and Oman, the Hadramaut area. What was interesting is that all the trade was maritime, and the people that controlled the trade were not Arabs, they were Ethiopians. What is today Eritrea? Adelus is the name that comes up over and over again there on the eastern coast of Eritrea. And those are the people whose names she found all over the western coast of India. They were the ones that were traded, and they did use the Red Sea. That's why this whole trade route theory by Montgomery Watt was then put into disrepute in 1987. So we're just talking a few years ago, not very long at all, a little about 30 years ago. She couldn't find any reference to the city of Mecca until 741. That's almost the mid-8th century. That's over 100 years after Muhammad's death. No reference at all to Mecca. She found it in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Continuato Byzantia Arabica. And the earliest map that they can find, and that's still the same day, they can't find it on any maps until the 900 AD. Not to the 10th century does it even make its way onto a map. Now, when I brought this out and I introduced this back in 1994 to Dr. Jamal Badawi, he had no answer for this. Until this day, no one really has had any answer to this. Muslims have not dealt with this problem. You've got to deal with Mecca. Now, interesting, if you look at modern Mecca today, take a look at what's happening in Mecca. They're building all these skyscrapers. That building right there with the clock tower, that's going to be the largest clock tower in the world. It's 45 feet across. It is, at the time it was built, that building was the 4th tallest building in the world. I don't know if it still is. It's modeled on Big Ben. You can see down here on the bottom left, Big Ben and this Abraj al-Bayt Tower, modeling it. They want to create Meccan mean time. They want all time to go through Mecca, and that's why they built that huge clock tower. But they're not stopping there. They're building all around that. They're building we understand this is what they want to build. These are some of the plans. I'm not sure which one they're going to choose, but these are the plans of what Mecca is going to look like. What's interesting is that to date, no ruins or discoveries have been found when excavating for these foundations. Now that's curious. all of these buildings that are going on, these enormous amount of excavations that are going on, unprecedented. I don't know of any place on earth that is getting as much building going on. I understand there may be as many as 50 of these skyscrapers that are going to be built. That's what I've been told. Don't quote me on that. What's interesting, though, is to build these skyscrapers, you've got to dig down deep. You've got to go right down into the soil. And whenever you do that, especially around a historical site, and this is the case in every historical place, there always must be people, archaeologists that go along with you, so that if you come across any ruin or any discoveries of ancient buildings, you must stop what you're building and they must extract it so to preserve it. But we don't know of any preservations. We don't know of anything that they have found as they've been digging down, which is curious if this city goes all the way back to 1900 BC and possibly even further. It is one of the oldest cities in history. Why have they not found any of these archaic ruins? Any places where Abraham lived, or even the fact that they could go back that far. Now, you can see the prophet's birth house there, and you can see the prophet's wife's house. That's Khadijah's wife's house. Those are now being destroyed, I understand, and there's a huge furore happening around the Muslim world because people they're just covering it up. They're just cementing it up. The question I want to ask is, why are they covering all this up? Why are they suddenly cementing? Now, I'll be told it's because to help the pilgrims who are there. But why is it they haven't found any ruins or archaeological discoveries as they're digging? That's the first question you should ask. Here's the third problem now. Problem of geography. Number two, the problem of Mecca. If you're having problems with Mecca, then you're going to have problems with the Qibla, because the Qibla, as we well know it, always must face Mecca. We know that. There's the Kaaba right there. You can see what happens during the Hajj, the millions of people that go there. If you want to know where the Qibla is today, you just go into any mosque and you'll see a mihrab, which is a niche that's put in the wall. Or like in my room there in Kuala Lumpur, you can see that arrow on my room where the Qibla was. You can get it on an app on your phones. So the Qiblas are not hard to find because they tell you where the Qibla is at any one point, anywhere you are in the world. Surah 2, ayah 143 to 150, talks about the change of the Qibla. And it's archaeologists support this change, but not from Jerusalem down to Mecca. Back in 1905, the first problems came up when Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fehérvadi, who were looking and had access to many of the old mosques, they were looking at the oldest mosques. They wanted to get to the original floor plans for these mosques, and they dug down to Fustat, which is the garrison town outside of Cairo. And they found a mosque there that had been built in 641, and they noticed that the Qibla was not facing towards Mecca. They went to Iraq, to the Wasit Mosque in 706, soon after the Kufa Mosque, both of them in Iraq, not too far from where Baghdad is, south of Baghdad, and they wanted to find out where the Qibla was. Well, they weren't looking for the Qibla, they were looking for the original floor plans, but they noticed that those Qiblas were facing west. The Fustat Mosque was facing east. They all should have been facing south, like you see on this map here. Mecca's down in the south. Both the Wasit and the Kufa Mosque should have been facing south, but they're facing west. The Fustat Mosque they found in 1905 was facing east. They thought it was Jerusalem, and so they said as much. We do know that the Jacob of Edessa in 705 suggests it's to Jerusalem, that the Maghrebs, that's another, remember the names that is given to them, Maghrebs, from Maghreb, not to the south of the Jews and the Maghreb here in the regions of Syria, pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba, the patriarchal places of their races. Don Gibson, therefore, decided to step in at this time, and this is where he's done a very help, and this is where I'm going to now use his newest material. And what he was looking at, he was interested in finding out about the Qiblas. Now, remember, Dan Gibson is an archaeologist. He has spent 30 years in the Middle East. So he has spent 30 years in the Middle East. He went there when he was 20 years old, and he was there for 30 years. But what was interesting, he decided to do and find out what he could find about Mecca. Now, actually, I'm going to be looking at more than 12 mosques. He only looked at 12 mosques. I'm going to be looking at more than just 12 mosques. But let's look and see what he found. He went to every one of these mosques, and he went to mosques that were built as early as the 623. This is the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Medina. But take a look. Now, the present-day Qibla is facing Mecca, sure enough. But in 1987, they notice, and it's called the Two Qiblas for a reason, because most Muslims think that the first Qibla the other Qibla would be towards Jerusalem, the second would be towards Mecca. But in 1987, they were refurbishing the mosque, and they found the original Qibla But the Qibla they found there in 1987, which is the original Qibla, was not facing Jerusalem. And it certainly wasn't facing Mecca. In fact, it was facing the other way. As far away as Guangzhou in China, which is Canton today in China, built in 630, they found that the Qibla there was 12 degrees off. When you look and see what happens from that far away, you can see the red is where the Qibla, it's facing Petra, not Jerusalem or Mecca. It goes right through Petra. The Fustat Mosque in Egypt, built in 641. The description of the original floor plan showed a Qibla to the east and later towards the south. Humayma Mosque in southwest Jordan. The Qibla there is facing directly Petra. It should be facing the completely opposite direction, as you can see in the drawing that he put there. But it's facing Petra. That's 700. Remember, the Qibla was canonized in 624. Let me keep reminding you. It was canonized in 624, according to Surah 2, I 142 to 150. So therefore, what is it here? We're now in Baalbek, in Lebanon. The Qibla is facing Petra in 701. That's the red line, not the black line is where Mecca should be. It should be facing towards the black line, but it's facing where the red line goes. Baalbek in Lebanon, you can see the Qibla runs right through Petra. Nowhere near Mecca. The Amman Citadel in Jordan in 701, the original Qibla pointed towards Petra. That's the lower one, the lower red one. You see the lower red one with the red line? That's the one that was built in 701. In 740, another mosque was built behind it. You can see it. It is facing Mecca. So something happens between 701 and 740. The Great Mosque of Sana'a, the capital city of Yemen, in 705. That Qibla, the red line, is facing Petra, not Mecca. The Kirbet al-Minya in Israel in 706, built by Al-Walid, who is the son of Abdul Malik, comes to power from 705 to 715. He builds this mosque on the shores of Galilee, inside the palace complex. Now the Kirbet al-Minya, its Qibla is not towards Mecca or Jerusalem, but towards Petra. Many people thought it was Jerusalem, but it's off. You can see how it's off by a number of degrees. They now know it is now facing Petra. The Wasat Mosque that Fahrenbadi and Creswell were looking at in 1905, built in 706. When Gibson looked at it, he now noticed that they thought it pointed towards Jerusalem, but he found that it was not pointing towards Jerusalem or Mecca. It was facing Petra. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's the one, not the Dome of the Rock that's up there on the upper right-hand side. The Al-Aqsa Mosque that's right in the center of the picture, that was built in 706. The Dome of the Rock was built in 691 by Abdul Malik. But when you look at the entire citadel of not only the Al-Aqsa Mosque built in 706, but also of the Dome of the Rock built in 691, look at it's built up on a citadel. Yet the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there you can see it looking down with a satellite image, looking straight down onto the entire citadel. You can see that the Al-Aqsa Mosque follows the red line right towards Petra. So does the Dome of the Rock. In fact, the entire citadel is facing Petra even today. The Damascus Mosque, built in 709, the Qibla is facing Petra. The Mosque of Umar in Basra, Syria, look at the date now, 720. We're coming up to almost 100 years after the Qibla was canonized. Remember, the Qibla was canonized, according to Islamic tradition, in 624. Now we're at 720, and the Qibla is facing Petra, not Mecca. Kirbat al-Mafjar in the West Bank, 724. We're exactly 100 years later. The Qibla is facing neither towards Jerusalem nor Mecca. It's facing Petra. The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon, 724. This is a good one because this one was abandoned and never rebuilt, which really helps those archaeologists today because nothing was built over top. You can look exactly and see where the Qibla is. Take a look at the entire enclosure and you will see that the Qibla goes straight towards Petra. Not Jerusalem on the left, nor Mecca on the black line. It goes straight towards Petra, 100 years after the Qibla was canonized. Notice how up to 725, all the Qiblas face Petra. As we get closer, they all come uniformly to Petra. There you can get a whole map of them. These are the ones that are found up until 725. So from the time of the prophet's death, if he died in 632, up until 725, so we're basically talking about roughly 100 years after Muhammad, every Qibla is facing Petra. None of them are facing Mecca. And they're uniformly facing Petra. You can't say that maybe they didn't know their way, their directions, they were using the stars. If they didn't know the direction, why is it they wouldn't be facing in all kinds of directions? The fact that they're all uniformly facing Petra. Now in 728, you find Qiblas that don't face either Petra or Mecca. This is the Qasr I can't quite see it because this thing keeps coming down and covering my Hayat al-Sharqi mosque in Syria. It's not till we get till 731, the Banbor Mosque in Pakistan, the first recorded Qibla which finally faces the correct direction. It faces Mecca. Isn't that interesting? Finally, 731, over 100 years after Muhammad's death, over 100 years after the canonization of the Qibla, we finally get a mosque that's facing the correct direction. 100 years later. And then the Mushta Mosque in Amman, Al Umayyad Mosque, facing Petra, built in 743. Hold on, why is it facing Petra as late as 743? The Ribat Fortress in Susa, Tunisia, in 770. Now here's what's interesting. The next three slides are going to show you three different mosques that are built in North Africa and Spain. Here is the Susa Mosque in Tunisia, built in 771. It's not facing either Petra nor Mecca. The Cordoba Mosque in Spain, built in 784, and again, is much like the Tunisian one. It's not facing either Petra nor Mecca, facing somewhere further south. The Great Mosque of Karaun in Tunisia in 870, neither facing Petra nor Mecca. And this puzzled Gibson when he noticed this in 2011. He didn't know how to answer this question. Why is it that all the North African mosques and the mosque in Spain were facing straight south and not facing Petra or Mecca? We'll come to that. What he didn't know is that all the Qiblas were facing towards Petra up until 725. There was a confusion for the next 100 years. 12% were facing Petra, 50% were facing Mecca, 38% were facing parallel. And it's not till 822 that all the mosques then face Mecca. That's 200 years after the Qibla was supposedly canonized, roughly 200 years. Why Petra? Well, take a look at this trade map. Remember, we've already looked at this trade map. What is at the center of trade? Look at the green dot and notice where the question mark is. Mecca is not at the center of trade in the 7th century, according to the trade routes. It is Petra that is at the center of the trade. So what is Petra? Well, I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's the center of the Nabatean kingdom. It existed long before. It existed from the 2nd century BC. It was one of the greatest civilizations of that time. It continued up until the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, up until the 7th century, in fact. And as we're going to find out, even up until the 8th century. But it started to diminish. It started to lose its clout. And it's where they had their tombs and temples. It was the center of the Nabatean kingdom. Petra, interestingly, is in a valley. It has a parallel valley. It has a stream going through it. It has fields, trees, grass. It has clay, loam, olive trees. It's near, if there were to be a pillar of salt, it would be right outside of Petra. Petra has all the items listed that we found out in the Quran above and in Islamic traditions. Thus, could Petra be the place that the Quran is referring to in all these geographical locations? Of the 65 geographical references in the Quran concerning where the Prophet lived, only 9 places named, including Ad, Thamud, Midian, they all are located near Petra, 600 miles away from Mecca, too far north. Significance? What we now know so far, nothing is known of Muhammad until the late 7th century. His biography, the Sirah and his sayings, the Hadith, don't appear until the 9th century. His city, Mecca, isn't referred to until the 8th century. Thus, much of what we know about Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like he is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly by Abdul Malik. Conclusions? Islam in the Prophet's life, as we know it, was not derived from the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years and then redacted back onto the Prophet's life and compiled in the 9th century. That's possibly his conclusion. Now, why are that there's so many Muslim sources are so late? Why do their claims not fit the historical record? Why are the geographical references so few and confusing? And why do they all seem to be much further north? Why are there so many references to vegetation which wouldn't exist in Mecca? Why is Mecca not mentioned until 741 and not on a map until 900? Why is Mecca not on the trade route? Why are all the Qiblas facing Petra for the first 100 years, confused for the next 100, and aren't standardized to Mecca until 822, 200 years too late? Therefore, much of what we know about early Islam is in doubt. So, what really happened? Now, this is my scenario. And here, now I'm going to say what I think happened. And this is where I'm going to be shot down. I know many people are going to jump on me, but bear with me. This is a possible scenario. What if, because of all these incongruities, because of all this confusion, can we put together and come to some type of conclusion? This is what I'm saying today, June 18th, 2016. It may all change within the next year, maybe in the next month. This is the beauty of historical criticism. You're always changing, moving on as new material comes to the fore. You've always got to redo and refine. So this is what I'm saying. This is what I believe possibly could have happened. To make sense of all this, we need to begin with Abd al-Malik, who ruled from 685 to 705. But he ruled way up in Damascus. What was he doing so far north? Why was he not in Jerusalem? Why was he not down in Medina? Well, obviously, because those places are, Medina is not the center of the world. You need to be where you can rule with power, and that's why he would have moved in Damascus. But that should be a curiosity that we should start with. Now, the Arabs control that part of the world since 642, Damascus and then. That's within 10 years of Muhammad's death, they now control Damascus. They control Jerusalem, Baghdad. So they also had Baghdad. Why doesn't he live in Baghdad? Why Damascus? For roughly 40 years now, so they have been in control. So from 642 up until 685, when he comes to power, they have now controlled that part of the world. The problem was they were not urban people. When you look at the Arabs, you will see they were nomadic. They lived in hamlets. They loved camels. They loved the desert. That's why you don't see many of their cities along the oceans and the seas. That's why they were not seafarers. They were primarily Arab nomadic desert people that lived in oases. And that's why the trade went up the Western Plateau. So it's fascinating that when you look at Islam today, you will see it's very sophisticated. It has laws and rules and regulations that fit an urban environment, but that could not have come out of a rural, nomadic desert environment. That should be a question we should be asking. So what happened that also gave these nomadic Arabs all this land? We do know that the Sassanids and the Byzantines were warring for 200 years. That's well known. And they basically ran out of money. They ran out of their treasures, which means they could not take care of the nomads. Now, up to that time, the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids were the ones that kept the Arabs in the desert. As long as they were being paid by the Byzantines and by the Sassanids, they were being kept in the desert. When they were no longer getting paid by their masters, the Sassanids and the Byzantines, they just let the Arabs do whatever they wanted. More than that, a vacuum then existed within the Sassanid and also in the Byzantine Empire. And that's why the Arabs moved right into that vacuum, and that's why it's well recorded. They took over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo within 10 years of Muhammad's death. Here's the problem. They don't know how to run cities. They have never run cities. They don't even live in the cities. They live outside the cities in garrison towns. Fustat is a garrison town of Cairo. But who's going to run the cities? They can't do it. They don't have any expertise. So they use people that are their cousins from the line of Abraham. They use Christians and Jews who were not only were they intellectuals, they were quite capable, they were also close to them as cousins from the same line of Abraham. And that's why they call them either Maulas or Mawalis. Now, what's interesting, they control the cities, but remember the Jews and Christians had an identity. They had a prophetic line that goes right from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in fact, all the Muslims, or the Arabs at this time, they weren't Muslims yet, the Arabs were dependent on that prophetic line. The problem is that prophetic line did not include any Arabs. There was no Arab in that prophetic line. The Arabs had no prophet. But the Jews and Christians did. And here are the Arabs now for 40 years. They have controlled these Jews and Christians. They were using the Jews and Christians to control their cities. And yet they were the ones in power. Yet they don't have an identity like the Jews and Christians. They need an identity. How do you create an identity? That was the problem of the Malik. When he comes to power in 685, he is the first one that does a number of things. First of all, look at the coins in the numismatic section. He takes off the images of what used to the dinar, the Byzantine dinar, were just made into Sufyani dirhams, sorry, you see about the bottom. But what's interesting is look at the images on the Byzantine dinar. You have the emperor with two retainers and then a Byzantine cross on the back side. The Arabs, starting with the Sufyani family or the Umayyad Caliph, all they did was retain the same coinage. They kept the image of the caliph instead, not the emperor. Now it's the caliph and two retainers, and on the backside is the Byzantine cross with the cross piece taken off. Where in the world would any Muslims have images? You're not permitted to have images in Islam. So there's the first problem. When Abdul Malik comes to power, you can see his coin up on the upper right, and you can see there's a picture of him with a sword. And there's that Byzantine cross again with the cross piece off. He then eradicates that, and in 1691 introduces new coinage. And take a look at what he introduces. No more images. Now he introduces the Arab script. This is the beginning of this Arab identity. He introduces the Arab script for the Arab people in the Arab language. More than that, he's then going to have to introduce something that's greater and bigger than the Jews and Christians. So he goes to Jerusalem, which is the seat of Byzantine Christianity. And remember, the Byzantines are the other great power at that time. How is he going to control and confront them? He builds a building right there in the middle of Jerusalem. But take a look at where he builds it. You can see where the Church of the Sepulchre is across the valley. That was a center of Byzantine Christianity. That was a center of Christianity in Jerusalem. He builds his building above it, up on the hill, across the valley, calls it the Dome of the Rock. Fascinating. You can see it. It's a beautiful building, and you can go, if you go to Jerusalem today, it stands out with its golden dome. He builds it in 691. So here's Abdul Malik. He's now created the coinage that has Arabic. He now puts the largest structure of its day, the greatest structure of its day, the most magnificent structure of the day, and it's a one-upmanship against the Byzantine Christians. And take a look at what he does. Look inside the Dome of the Rock. It's much larger and more prominent in the holiest city for the Jews and Christians. Surely it should have been Damascus or Mecca, but why not? Because he wants to have a greater building to one-up the Christians, especially the Byzantine Christians. Now, what we've been told about the Dome of the Rock is that it was built there to commemorate the Miraj, the movement up through the seven heavens, where Muhammad receives the 50 prayers and whittles it down to 5 prayers. But take a look at the inscriptions. Look at the inscriptions on the inner and outer ambulatory of the Dome of the Rock. That's the only part of the Dome of the Rock that is the original part. That's the only original part of the building. The Dome of the Rock has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. The only original part are the 2 ambulatories. And they have Arabic inscriptions. In fact, what's interesting, they are the earliest Quranic inscriptions we can find. When you look at those inscriptions along the inner and outer ambulatory, take a look at what they say. There's no reference whatsoever to the Miraj. Surah 112, there is no God but God. He is one. He has no associate. Who's that against? Say, he is God, the one, God, the eternal besought of all. He begetteth not, nor was begotten. Who do you think that's against? And there is none comparable unto him. Muhammad is a messenger of God. That's the first time Muhammad is introduced into Arab literature. This is where Muhammad is finally introduced, and it's Abdul Malik. He introduces it there on the coins, the Shahada on the coins that is introduced the same year, and also on the Dome of the Rock in Surah 112. O people of the scripture, do not exaggerate in your religion. That's us. Nor utter aught concerning Allah save the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah. Here it is. It's attacking Jesus again. And his word which he conveyed unto Mary, and his spirit from him. So believe in Allah and his messengers, and say not free, cease. Better for you. Allah is only one God, for far is it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son. It's confronting the sonship of Jesus Christ. It's confronting the Trinity, and it's confronting, again, the whole emphasis, the whole foundation of Christianity. That's in Surah 4, Ayah 171. Then we have Surah 17, Ayah 111. Praise be to God, who hath not taken unto him his son. There it again is, confronting the sonship of Jesus Christ. And who hath no partner. There it is, confronting the idea that Jesus would be the partner of God. In the sovereignty, nor hath he any protecting friend through dependence. In every case of these three, just take a look. This is an attack against Byzantine Christianity. This is an attack against Jesus. This is an attack against the Trinity. It's an attack against everything we stand for. That's why the Dome of the Rock was built. It was not built to commemorate the Miraj. There's nothing on the Dome of the Rock that talks about the Miraj. And take a look at the Qibla. Abdul Malik therefore introduces his Arab identity. Why? By beginning with the Dome of the Rock. That's his masterpiece. It's larger than any other non-Arab structure. It's facing the Arab sanctuary Petra. It incorporates inscriptions against Byzantine Christianity. It introduces their faith, Islam. It introduces their people, Muslim. It introduces their prophet Muhammad. So that's where we get the introduction of the word Islam, that people call the Muslims, and the name of the prophet called Muhammad, all introduced in 691. When you look at the Caliphal protocols, this is what Dr. Yehuda Nevel looked at. And when he looked at them, he noticed that all the Caliphal protocols from the Sufyani period, these are the official documents put together by the caliphs. These are the Umayyad caliphates. The caliphs up until the Marwanid period, which is introduced by 680 by Marwan I, the Sufyani family then is taken over by the Marwanid family. Marwan the first son is Abdul Malik. He takes over in 685, and all the caliphal protocols, take a look at them. He said they don't have the Bismillah as we have it today. There's no reference to Muhammad. There's no reference to people called Muslims. There's no reference to any religion called Islam. Yet these should be the first documents of Islam. They should be replete with names of Muhammad and Muslim in Islam. They don't have any of this until 691. Yehuda Nevo says, take a look and see, almost overnight in 691, suddenly Muhammad is introduced. The Bismillah, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, the compassionate one, the merciful one, is then introduced there on the Caliphal protocols. And from that time on, every Caliphal protocol from 691 then starts with the Bismillah, the one that we see today. And the Shahada is introduced. He then mints it on new coins in 692. So he replaces the images of the images with Arabic script and introduces the Shahada on the coin. So you have three things that Abdul Malik does in 691 and 692. Builds the Dome of the Rock, changes the Caliphal protocols, and introduces coins. All of them with the intention of creating an Arab identity. Now they have their own prophet. They have the earliest manuscripts. So he introduces them, he has a need, because if a prophet is introduced, he then needs to have a revelation. Every prophet needs a revelation. And that's where the earliest Quranic texts are now found on the Dome of the Rock. The earliest Quranic manuscripts begin to appear during his reign and his son Al-Walid and on. We're not going to get into that night. That's a whole nother talk, looking at when the earliest manuscripts come to be. But what's interesting, they all fit the same scenario. None of these manuscripts are complete, nor are they parallel today's Quran completely. And they continue to be changed and corrected by later caliphs up until the 9th century. The sanctuary in Petra is destroyed by an earthquake in 713. We haven't even time to get into that. Thus, a new place is needed, and it looks like Mecca is the one that is chosen, possibly chosen by the rebel Abdul ibn Zubair in 783, earlier. And that's why you have the rebellion going on against the Umayyads, and then you have those in Kufa who then join the rebellion of Zubair. Though Zubair is then destroyed by the Umayyads, it's the Kufans who become later the Abbasids, who then confront the Umayyads, and they are the ones that looks like Elizabeth, who then decide to make Mecca their place in contradistinction to the Umayyads, who used their sanctuary in Petra. Now, here's the possible scenario. Now that the Muslims have a prophet, Muhammad, they have a revelation in the Quran, and they have a sanctuary, Mecca, they need a history. That's why it takes them till the 9th century, 833, to finally write the story down. That's why it takes them to the late 9th century, 870, to finally write down. Remember, it's well known that Al-Bukhari was given 600,000 of these stories, and he's to whittle them down and only keep that which is authentic. And he throws out 98%, only retains 2%, so it's around 4,697, and throws out another 98%. And so therefore, what we have as Al-Bukhari's Sahih Bukhari is that 9 volume that we have is only 2% of what he threw out. Why? Possibly because this is where they whittled out and rechanged and destroyed the earlier history. The tafsir that is introduced by Al-Tabari in 923. So you have the story, you have the sayings, and then you have the tafsir, which then makes sense of the Quran itself. So by the 9th century, they have a book, the man, the place, and the story. And a new religion is now being formed and growing. Yet this did not happen within a mere 22 years, like Muslims like to tell us, like the world like to tell us, like all our schools like to tell us, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. Summation, and let's come to a conclusion now. New books are being published which question the classical account of Islam's beginning, asking questions such as, why are there no Muslim sources for 200 years? Why do the claims they make not fit the historical record? Why are the geographical references so few and confusing? Why do they all seem to be much further north? Why are there no references to vegetation which wouldn't exist in Mecca? Why is Mecca not mentioned until 741, nor included in any maps until 900? Why is Mecca not even on the international trade route? Why do all the Qiblas face Petra for the first 100 years, then confused for the next 100 years, and are not standardized to Mecca until 822, 200 years too late? What is Abdul Malik's role in all of this? Does a nascent Islam really begin with him? Since much of what we know about early Islam is now in doubt, since much of the Quran is also in doubt, that's something we haven't talked about tonight, since nothing is known of Muhammad until the 7th century, or Mecca until the 8th century, or his story until the 9th century, hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away, can we conclude that Islam is nothing more than a later redaction possibly begun by Abdul Malik in its present form, then continued by his descendants, proving that Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran? So who is he and what is his purpose? We've got the wrong man at the wrong place doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Now, when we look at Jesus Christ, and I'll end with this, we know where he was born. He was born in Bethlehem. We know where Jesus grew up. He grew up in Nazareth. We know where Jesus died and when, in Jerusalem, in around 33 AD. We know what Jesus did, at least for the last 3 years especially. We know from eyewitness accounts, Matthew and John. We know from even hostile accounts, Thallus, Tacitus, Josephus, and others. We know when they were written, between 50 to 60 years later. Few doubt his historicity. Thus, when we look at Jesus versus Muhammad, we have the right man at the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. Historians set the stage, we move it on. The questions they ask, we research and expand. We must confront Islam's historical foundations. We must challenge Muhammad and the Quran. We must demand the same of the Bible and Jesus Christ. In fact, we must demand this of any historical person and any historical book. We must bring both into the public sphere and then let people come to their own conclusions. Why? Because similar historical questions have already been asked of Christianity and answered. We need to bring our friends home. Okay, John, I'll bring it back, give it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jay, for that fascinating presentation. You can stop sharing your screen if you want, so we can chance to do that. There you go. So this is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to
get some water real quickly while you're
go ahead. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you guys would like to interact with Jay and ask him a question, make comments, or engage with him in that way, then you are invited to raise your hand. And I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Jay and to dialogue with him about any of the material that he has covered in his historical critique of the origins of Islam. Okay, Stephen Tilley is up. For some reason, I'm having some difficulties. Second.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, Stephen Tilley, you're up.
Okay. First, what's up, John and Jay? It was something. It was regarding. It was in Robert Spencer's book. He mentions a quotation from a Jewish report about some prophet invading Jerusalem around 7th century timeline. And they basically rejected him because said that no prophet comes with a sword. Do you know anything about that source that I'm referring to by any chance?
Stephen, the only thing I can think of is probably the Doctrina Iacobi, which is dated to 634, or writings of Sabaeus, which are dated to 660. Those are the only two that I'm familiar of. And I do know that they do talk about a prophet. I can't remember if it's a prophet who comes with a sword. I think Sabaeus, writings of Sabaeus in 660, warns Christians of this prophet and that he is not to be trusted. That's all I can remember. But that's, again, not Muslim sources. That is from outside. That is extra Arabic sources.
Yeah, because I've heard about it. Yeah, because I read about it a while back. I just can't remember off the top of my head.
We do have the Maghazi documents, which are from Ibn Hisham, refers to them, and they are supposedly the earliest part of the material that of course, he gives credit to Ibn Ishaq. The Maghazi documents are all about the raids of this Muhammad. Now, if that's what they're referring to, then certainly, according to the earliest sirahs, they do believe that the earliest material would be the raids of Muhammad. So maybe that's referring to that. I don't know.
Yeah, just can't remember off the top of my head. I just know that the timeline, it cannot be Muhammad because it's little too early, if I recall correctly, than traditional Islamic timeline.
Well, actually, 634 is a little too late.
Yeah, sorry. I just can't remember the whole detail off the top of
Yeah,
my
and
head.
that's why people are
I
curious.
just know the timeline's off
But
regarding
then
the Islamic one.
where do we get the reference to 632, his death? That we get from Al-Bukhari, which is not to the 9th century.
Yeah, so basically it can't be Muhammad's because Muhammad would have been dead by that point, and the person claiming to be a prophet, it can't be Abu Bakr since, uh, at least not off the top of my head that I recall, Abu Bakr never once claimed to be a prophet.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, just thought I'd throw that out and ask you that. Anyway, thanks for your time, and hope catch y'all another time. Jonathan, if you'd be so kind, kick me off as a co-panelist.
Okay, next up is Tiger. Let me bring up Tiger.
All right, I gotta go. I'll catch y'all later.
Okay.
God bless and peace in Jesus Christ our Lord.
All right, bye-bye, Steve.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Hi, can you hear me?
Tiger, we can hear you.
All right, good.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Scott. Sorry about that. Tiger is the screen name that I used to log into this computer. I wanted to ask Jay a few questions that I have based on this presentation and other times I've seen it on YouTube. The first one is, what religion was practiced by these Arabs before this time in 691 when we suspect that Abdul Malik created the new religion? What were they praying to, or who, what god or gods? And were there mosques? I think you mentioned some mosques that were built before this time. What is a mosque? What does that word masjid mean? And does it predate Islam as we know it?
Yeah, let me just, great questions, Scott. Let me just go ahead and respond to what is a mosque to begin with. And the masjid is a gathering place. That's what it means, a gathering place. So it could be, it's the Arabic reference to the gathering place. Now, what's interesting is, what did the Nabateans is who you're talking about. The Nabateans, we just had a researcher go through, and we haven't yet published it. It's going to be published soon, looking at the whole Nabatean antecedents to Islam. And what he has found is that the Nabateans are the ones that give us the Arabic language. Arabic comes from Nabatean. And it's interesting also that the Nabateans do have gods. It looks like that every Nabatean sanctuary or every Nabatean city had its own god. You have the Nabatean god of Dushara, which is well known because that's the god of Petra. Interesting that also you have the goddess of Lut, Al-Lut, the god, who is a female goddess. And according to some of the material we're now getting out about the Nabateans, that the Allah is also a Nabatean god, that Allah has a wife named Al-Lut, whose other name is Al-Uzza. Al-Lut, Al-Uzza, these are two goddesses of the same person, looks like the wife of Allah. Al-Manat is another goddess. And so you have these different goddesses and these different gods in the different cities. What's fascinating to me, we've heard Al-Lut and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat. These are found in Surah 53, Ayah 19 and 20 in the Quran. These are known as the satanic verses. These are the three goddesses. It's the whole story behind the satanic verses we won't go into right now. But it looks like this verse, these two verses in 19 and 20 are referring back to these Nabatean gods and goddesses. And if this is true, that Allah would be the consort of Allah, and yet in Surah 6, Ayah 101, and Surah Ayah 102, it says that God cannot have a consort, that confronts the notion that Allah can have a wife. Because Allah did have a wife. Her name was Allah, which is some Arabists say is the feminine form of Allah. Now, you can see that's an awful lot needs to be done on these gods and these gods. What were these mosques? These were masjids, that's the Arabic name, but a gathering place is well known because that's what they were called in Nabatean as well. Remember, masjid would be the same word in Nabatean. So it was a place to gather to pray. It's a place to gather to give to do puja to these gods and goddesses. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. I'm guessing that those are some of the same gods, perhaps, that were inside the Kaaba, where there were as many as 360 idols. Is that right?
You know, where did you get that story about 365 idols in a Kaaba?
From the Muslim sources, of course.
And which sources have you gone to get that?
Oh, I just have heard it from but that's what the Muslims say. I don't know where it comes from, sir.
And they come from the 9th and 10th century. Do you trust them?
No, I don't trust any of it anymore.
After what you've heard tonight, do you think there was any Kaaba in Mecca?
I have no idea. That would be a question for someone who might tell us when it was constructed. How about that?
Let me take it one step further. Hitti, who is a historian, has noted that there were many Kaabas in the Arabian Peninsula. There was a Kaaba in Yathrib, there was a Kaaba in Taif, there was a Kaaba in Tabuk, there was a Kaaba in Khaybar. All of these oases along what we call the Western Plateau, or the trade route that traded in leather and clothes, all not spices, but leather and clothes. All these oases all had a Kaaba. It was normal to have Kaabas, because if you're having caravans coming through, you would want to make sure that they would also do puja at your Kaaba, so that you would enrich yourself. You would charge them for doing the puja there, and that's another way to make money. So every one of these oases had Kaaba. Mecca is not unique, and the Meccan Kaaba, we don't even hear about it. We don't hear about Mecca until 741. For that's the 8th century, another 100 years after Muhammad died. So all of this is now being put in doubt as to whether there was any Kaaba. And that's why, isn't it interesting, they are now cementing up everything around the Kaaba. Wouldn't you love to get back to Mecca and do a little bit more digging and find out what we now know about Mecca? I would love to get there. We're not going to be able to. You can see the pictures as to what they're doing. They're cementing up the entire place.
Yes, I see. All right, I got another series of questions. This one is about the Qibla. We talked about the Qibla a lot. You did. I was wondering, what does it point towards? What is it that's there? Is it the building? Is it the black rock? Does Allah's presence come to earth inside of the building, like the presence of Yahweh in the tabernacle? And why are the Muslims bowing towards it? Are they worshiping Allah or the black stone or something in that direction? And isn't that idolatry if they're worshiping something other than Allah?
Lovely question. And you're hitting all the best questions, Scott, because you're doing what I was not able to do because of time. According to what we now found, is that black rock is well known. It is a Nabatean. It is an Abbatean rock. And it is well documented that there was a black rock in Petra. Petra was always where the black rock situated, and where the black rock was is where the sanctuary was. Possibly it could have been a meteorite. That's why it had such a mystical, ethereal approach to it. Whatever the reason is, it is written about. That's why we're now looking at the Nabateans. And what's fascinating is the black rock in Petra, according to Zubair is the one that goes to Petra, and that's where he then sets up camp. Zubair is the one that rebels against the Umayyads. He rebels in 683 against Marwan. And of course, later on, 690, then it would be Abd al-Malik. And so he is the one that takes that black rock and takes it out of Petra. So where does it end up? Wherever the black rock is, that is the sanctuary. That's why all these mosques are facing that sanctuary where the black rock always stood. Where would that sanctuary be today? Have you just seen in the news in the last 2 weeks? I think it was just about a week ago. A new structure has been found outside of Petra. And they're now looking at it. Take a look. It was in the news here in BBC. I don't know if it made it in America. I don't know where you're from, Scott. But here in BBC, it's a new structure that they're going to be looking at, because it's such a big structure and it looks like it may be a sanctuary. It's right there. It's been there the whole time, but no one's noticed it until a week ago. Now that could be where, as they uncover it, we may find more about it that may have something to do with the original sanctuary in Petra. We don't know. Hold this space. What we do know is the black rock used to be there. When the black rock was taken, so did everything go with it. But why was the black rock taken? Another thing you need to be careful of. You need to realize there were 2 earthquakes that hit Petra. One in 551 AD and one in 713. 551 was right before Muhammad was born. He was born in 570. When these earthquakes hit, they damaged the 551 damaged Petra enormously. The 713 one destroyed Petra. When a city is destroyed, that is the sanctuary, it no longer retains its position, because no longer that's one way humans know that God's presence is no longer there. And when the black rock is taken, God's presence goes with it. So wherever the black rock is found, that is where God's presence is. Now it's in the Kaaba today. But what in the world is the black rock doing in the Kaaba? That's as idolatrous as you can get. And you see, many people are trying to kiss it. Why would you kiss a stone? Unless, of course, it's idolatry. So even the black rock is incongruous. It has no congruity, has no theological importance. It's contradictory to what we know about Islam, unless you look at the historical antecedents. Now we can understand why it was brought down, because it then created the presence of God there in Mecca when Mecca was chosen.
All right, great. Thank you, Jay. That's all the questions that I had for now. And I just wanted to say thanks to Jonathan and to you as well for the ministries that you both have. God bless you.
Well, thank you. Let me bring up Arkson to.
Hear me?
Hey, Arkson, we can hear you just fine. Go ahead.
My name is Arkan. I had a class with you, Jay, 8 years ago in Oxford. How are you? Sorry, I can't. I'm holding my camera actually with my hand. I have a few questions for you. You mentioned that Bukhari and Muslim are from 240, around 240 after the death of Muhammad. I've been trying to find manuscripts for them, and I can't find anything before the 1700s. Have you found anything? Have you encountered this question before? I've heard that the earliest is Fath al-Bari, but I didn't find an ancient manuscript of it. So do you know anything about manuscripts of Bukhari or Muslim?
Axon, you've got me there. I don't know where the earliest manuscripts are. I'm not even sure that they've been dated. The difficulty with manuscript evidence is that this is just in its germinal phase. We are just beginning to look at Quranic manuscripts, and Quranic manuscripts are much more important than Hadith. No one has even asked whether or not Ibn al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or Ibn Dawud or Tirmidhi, whether they are even authentic. We've just taken it on their word. But remember, for 1400 years, we have taken the Muslims' word as suggesting that all of these are authentic. And remember, Axon, you have heard over and over again that the Quran is exactly the same today as it was the day it was written down, the same that is in heaven. We have none of us have ever objected to that until the last 20 to 30 years. It's only in my lifetime that people are finally, well, maybe a little bit more in my lifetime, but it's really come to the fore that we're finally asking the question you're asking about the Hadith. Wait, give us time. We'll get to the Hadith. Right now, we're having our hands full with the Quran.
The reason why I'm asking about the Hadith is because I encountered one about the Mongol invasion, that a supposed prophecy that predicts the Mongol invasion, and the author of that Hadith seems to think that that was the end of the world. So it must have been written during that time, which is between 1200 and 1300, and it cannot be earlier. I have another question.
Go ahead.
Have you heard of Muhammad and Rasulullah on the Dome of the Rock, that it's a description of Jesus? I read somewhere, I can't remember where anymore, that this is a description of Jesus and not about Muhammad, because Muhammadan is in Tanween, it's an adjective and not a name in the writing, in the inscription.
Actually, I wish I could help you more there. I have heard that. I don't know enough about it to give you an answer for that. I do know that the name Muhammad is there, and it is. I don't think too many people doubt that that name is not there. It's also on the coins. It's also on the Caliphate protocols. We have three different sources from 691 and 692 that support the notion that that name is Muhammad. If it is an adjectival phrase or anything to do with that, that's something I cannot answer you for now. It would be surprising, though, that it would be nothing more than an adjective, because it would not be replaceable in all three categories.
I know some. I know. For example, Robert Spencer has argued that Muhammad actually, in these contexts, meant the praised one, and he argues that the picture on the coins actually is depicting Jesus. I don't have a position on that. I'm just throwing that out there.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you so much, Jay. God bless you.
All right. Well, thank you, Parkson. Let's bring up Paul Christensen. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Paul. Are you there?
I'm not sure if he's there. He has his hand up. Okay, he's just muted himself.
Okay, I see a hand come into where his camera is. Paul, are you there? Now I see a head.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead.
We can't hear you anymore.
I can hear you, Paul. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? No? Okay. I can't hear you. No, now I can hear you. I can hear you, Paul. Go ahead and talk. People are saying they can hear me.
Yeah, Rudolph and I can hear Jay, but not Paul as well.
No, he's talking. No sound coming from him.
Paul, if you want, you can maybe submit a question in the Q&A box, and we'll get it there that way. Or you can maybe write in the chat window what you wanted to ask, and I can read it to Jay.
I can see Paul talking, but I can't hear a word he's saying.
Yeah. While Paul is trying to get that figured out with his sound, let me just read a few questions from the Q&A box. We had Michael ask, one of the oldest is in mosque, which was built 629 AD, question mark. How does Jay explain it then? The mosque still exists, and is Jay aware of it? The name of the mosque is Chairman.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Correct.
All right, I tried changing my microphone around. All right, so I'll get on with my question then.
Okay, go ahead.
You were saying that, let's see, in the Quranic geography book, he was saying that when Uthman was sorting through the various hadith to decide what was legitimate and what wasn't, that based on his biases, he may have thrown out authentic hadith that would have supported the idea that Muhammad came from Petra. Do you have any further material on that, or any knowledge of people who are pursuing that angle?
That's a good question. The 600,000 akhbars that he was given, now remember, he was given this between 850 and 870, so we're talking a good 200 to 240 years after Muhammad's death. He is given these akhbars supposedly of references, direct references of Muhammad. He's to whittle them down, and he does so. He gets it down to 7,397, roughly 7,400, and throws everything else out. Now, why? And the question we are asking is, why 240 years later, has he thrown out 98% of it? What was his agenda? What was his criteria? What did he do with it? Where is it today? Why can't we look at it? Wouldn't you love to be able to look at it to see what is it that he threw out? And why did he only retain 2%? Such a little amount. Unless there was an agenda here, unless there was a reasoned excising of any material that had to do with Petra. It looks like that there was an awful lot of censorship going on. What's interesting is he's so late. Certainly these akhbars should have come from somewhere. Why can't we find all the material that came earlier? Why can't we find anything until 870? That's what I'm asking. Now, this other gentleman that came up earlier, Axon, said that maybe even that hadith, maybe even 12th and 13th century, we may not even be able to say that these are 9th century. I'm not going to go there right yet. I'm going to keep to the 9th century, that these are authentic. The difficulty I'm having is 240 years of what? Now remember, in every akhbar that he's given a matan, and then he's given an isnad. The matan would be the actual, the material itself. The isnad would be go ahead of it, which would give the chain of names from which this matan comes from, to give it an authoritative change. And what many Muslims will tell you is that the reason he threw out 98% is because they had bad isnads. But who says that they were bad isnads? And how does anybody know whether or not they were good or bad isnads? Because all those chain of names that goes from the 7th century up until the 9th century, that whole list of names never wrote anything down. So-and-so got it from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so. But how do we know any of those so-and-sos were correct? So you've got a real problem here, because this is nothing more than oral tradition. So we're basing everything we know on oral tradition if these akhbars are as Muslims tell us. And I don't trust oral tradition for one very good reason. You play the game, probably if you have children, you do this in your birthday parties, where you tell someone one thing and they tell the next person, they tell the next person, they tell the next person. By the time it gets to the 30th person, within 15 minutes, what you tell the first person and the 30th person has changed. We know this as Chinese whispers or telephone. And that's the difficulty with oral tradition. Oral tradition, by definition, can be changed, and of course, especially if it's oral tradition dealing with someone that you trust, someone who is important to your identity, as Muhammad would be. Anything that is wrong, anything that is deleterious, anything that would be seen as well, contrary to his character, would be excised out. And I think this is what we're finding here, an enormous excising of everything that did not fit. Now, was there a committee with him? Who knows? We don't know. All we know is that he was given this responsibility. And that's why it's important that we are skeptical of those traditions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoy following your work. You guys can turn me off now. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Bye-bye, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Let me, there's no hands currently raised. Folks, if you want to raise your hand, then just click raise your hand and I'll promote you. Let me just, while we're waiting for that, let me just read some of the questions in the Q&A box. So Michael asked, Michael's a Muslim, one of the oldest is in mosque, which was built in 629 AD. How does Jay explain it then? The mosque still exists, and is Jay aware of it? The name of the mosque is Chirman Juma Mosque. What do you say to that, Jay?
628 or the 627, the Guangzhou? Or is he talking about
He says 629.
There is the what they call the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Medina, which is 623. And of course, the Guangzhou Mosque, which is in Canton, which is 627. Why is it that they still exist? I think maybe because that's not so very long ago. That's only 1,400 years ago. If that would make sense that they would still be around. What is interesting is the fact that they have still retained, and that they have retained their structures. What was interesting about the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Medina, when they did this refurbishment in 1987, they found the original Qibla. They found that one, which if you look at the picture that I had, it goes off to the side. And of course, the line that it points towards is not Jerusalem. It is north, but it is actually pointing right towards Petra. So even though it was covered up with sand, even though it was not known for many centuries. In 1987, when they uncovered it, they found that that original mosque, the older part of that mosque, was facing Petra. Now, you might say, are these mosques, are these Islamic? No, they were probably Nabatean to begin with, and that's why even as far away as in Canton, in 630 or 627, you would have trade going back and forth between the Nabateans and the Arabs, and of course the Chinese. There is some notion that possibly even Muhammad's uncle made it as far as Canton, and is according to tradition. Now, this is all tradition, so I don't know if I believe it or not. But according to tradition, he is the one that's credited with building the Guangzhou Mosque. But it's fascinating. He builds it and directs it towards Petra, not towards Mecca.
Great. Michael actually wanted to make comment himself, so I promoted him. Go ahead, Michael.
Jay, this is Michael. The mosque I was talking about was, it's in India. It's not in in Arab world. It's in India, and here in India, the oldest mosque and the oldest Muslims are in a state known as Kerala. So how do you explain that? They have a tradition. Like Muslims did not come in India in the 11th century, but they came in the 7th century through a trade. How do you explain that? The fact that those people still exist. So whatever you're saying that it does not, Islam was spread in the 9th century, it falls down when you see in India, Muslims existed from the 7th century itself. They converted, How do you explain all these things?
Michael, I have no problem with believing that there were Muslims in the 7th century, probably there, but I would suggest, where is your material to support that there was a mosque built in Kerala that has a Qibla towards Mecca? Can you tell me that? With the oldest mosque that we can find in the Indian subcontinent is in Banbor, and Banbor Mosque is dated, let me get the date correctly, it's dated 731, so that's 8th century. There is no mosque that we know of that's earlier than the 8th century. You may say that they are from Kerala. Can you support it? Can you source it? Can you get material that would stand up to criticism that shows that that mosque is that old? I know that many people would like to believe, and just like there are many people that like to believe an awful lot of what tradition tells them, you need to make sure that the one in Kerala can support what you're saying, can support, and that you can source it, and that you can actually prove that that is as old as you say it is. Are you still there, Michael?
Yeah, I'm still there. I have one more question, Jay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and in the very first, screenshot you showed as Muhammad is the greatest. You said, right? Muslims, I don't think Muslims, when they say Muhammad is the greatest, they don't mean Muhammad is greater than Jesus. They don't say that, because in Quran it makes it very clear. We make no distinction between prophets. Only God can make that distinction. That is God's business to decide who is better than, because God is all knowing. He decides who is better, not we mortals. We don't say Muhammad is greater than Jesus or Jesus is greater than Muhammad. We don't say that. That goes against the Quran.
Good man, and I think you're right, Michael. Muslims have to be careful about making Muhammad the greatest. In fact, say Allahu Akbar, it would be the greater. But what's interesting to me is, even when you look at your Quran, and let me give you some surahs to look at. If you look at Surah 19, Ayah 20, if you look at Surah 3, Ayah 46, you just write these down, and I'll tell you why these are important. If you look at Surah 3, Ayah 49, and then if you look at Surah 19, Ayah 19. So start with 19, verse 20, go to 3, verse 46, go to 3, verse 49, and then go to Surah 19, verse 19. You will see that they all talk about Isa. Now, whether Isa is Jesus or not, what is interesting, when you compare Isa with Muhammad in the Quran, in your own book, in Surah 19, Ayah 20, Isa is born of a virgin. Muhammad was born normally from Amina. There's nothing spectacular about his birth. So you already see there's something different between Isa and Muhammad in your own Quran. He is greater in his birth. In Surah 3, Ayah 46, in your Quran, it says that Isa could speak from the cradle. I don't believe he did, but that's not, I know where that story comes from. But it's in your Quran, so I'm just using your Quran as a base. Your Quran suggests that Isa could speak from the cradle, whereas Muhammad could not speak from the cradle. 3 verses later, in verse 49, it says that this Isa, as a little child, could take some mud into his hand, form them into birds, blow on them, and fly up into the air. Could Muhammad do anything like that? Is Muhammad able to do any miracle? It says in verse 49 that Isa gives sight to the blind, he also heals the lepers, and he also resuscitates the dead. Where did Muhammad do anything like that? Even in your Quran, it's very clear that Muhammad could not do what Isa could do. And then we end off with Surah 19, Ayah 19, which says that Isa is the righteous one. Muhammad was not righteous. Muhammad sinned, had to ask for forgiveness for sins right through the Quran. In Surah 48, Ayah 1 and 2, it's very clear that Muhammad has to ask for sins, if that is Muhammad, has to ask forgiveness for sins he has done before he's a prophet, and sins he is yet to do even as a prophet. So your prophet has a sinful man. Jesus is the righteous one. So according to your Quran, it's very clear that Isa is superior to Muhammad.
No, I don't believe that. You're trying to see, even Moses has turned a stick into a snake. That does make him greater than Jesus or Abraham. No, we don't compare. We believe prophets came to this world to do God's mission. And the Quran is not about Prophet Muhammad. It's about God's message to mankind. We don't exaggerate Muhammad to what the Christians did to Jesus. Just because Jesus spoke from cradle, that does not mean Muhammad is inferior to him. Jesus spoke in cradle to defend what? To defend Mother Mary, right? See, and one more thing, I have one more question, which is off topic.
Let me respond to that, Michael. That's true, and it's obvious when you look at your Quran that Jesus could do a lot more than Muhammad could do. But here's some other things I just ask you to look at. Can Muhammad really be a prophet if he doesn't come in the prophetic line? It's very clear that God stipulated what the prophetic line is in Genesis chapter 17, when Abraham asked God, what about my son Ishmael? And God said to Abraham, I will bless him. He will have 12 sons. They will be the leader of 12 nations. But my covenant, in verse 19 and 20, my covenant is with Isaac. In chapter 22 of Genesis, suddenly Ishmael is completely missing, because then God comes to Abraham and says, give me your one and unique son, your one and only son. 3 times he says that in chapter 22. What happened to Ishmael? As far as God is concerned, Ishmael is no longer important. The only one that's important is Abraham and Isaac. It's through the line of Isaac. That's where the covenant comes. And all the prophets come in the line of Isaac. So where does Muhammad have to do? He's not in the prophetic line. If you claim that he is from Ishmael, then I would have to say that I would have to treat him as God treats him. He doesn't treat him at all. And that's why there is no reference to Muhammad in the Old Testament. There's no reference to Muhammad in the New Testament. No one knows about him. And the only person that even says he's a prophet is himself. Now, that's not much of a thing to go on. And that's why I would suggest that if you're going to claim that he is a prophet, remember, he didn't do anything that prophets are supposed to do. Every prophet is either to do a miracle or he is to do a prophecy. What miracle and what prophecy did Muhammad do? He didn't. Every prophet is to receive a revelation that coincides with all the previous revelations. Take a look at the Bible and the Quran. If that is his revelation, I don't believe it is, but you do. And if you look at the Quran with the Bible, it is contradiction after contradiction against my Bible. Therefore, I have to reject him. And then in Deuteronomy 18, that you like to go to say that he is a prophet, read verse 18, but then read verse 19 and 20. In verse 18, it's very clear that God says to Moses, there shall come unto you a prophet like you from amongst your people. Now, you know Muhammad cannot be that, because he's not from the people that Moses comes from. He's not from the Israelites. And then it says very clearly in verse 19 and 20, be careful of any prophet who does not come in my name. What name is he coming in? Look at verse 17. The name is Yahweh. That's the name that God requires all prophets to use. Yahweh. That is not Allah. He says, be careful of any prophet that does not come in my name. And if a prophet comes in another name of another God, put him to death. So, Michael, I'm going to have to put Muhammad to death, because he does not come in the name of God. He does not know the name of Yahweh. And therefore, I have to obey what my Bible says. If he comes in the name of another God, a pagan God, as Allah is, he's a Nabatean God, as we found out tonight. He has a wife named Alat, and another whose other name is Al-Uzza, known as the Satanic verses. He therefore has a consort. He's a polygamous God, but he is not a monotheistic God. It's a polytheistic God, a pagan God. I have to reject him. And that's why I don't follow Muhammad, nor do I go to him. He's nothing like my Jesus. Come on home. Come on home to Jesus. What a man. What a prophet. What a God.
I'm 100% sure Islam is the truth. I'll have to respond. Just give me 1 minute. And you
Yeah.
said that the prophets have to come from a prophetic line, right? There are
Yeah.
Jews who believe they were prophets who were non-Jews. So it sounds like the God you worship is a very racist kind of God. So we don't judge people based on their race or their blood. We judge people based on the works they do. And you said I'm not a big fan of using Bible to prove Prophet Muhammad is the messenger.
Let me respond to that, Michael. It's a good point. And I've heard many Muslims say that we follow a racist God. There's no racism about it because God chose the Jews through which the Messiah was reborn. That's all that they were done. They're only here for which the Messiah could come. It's not that only Jews are to be saved. If that were the case, I'm not a Jew and my wife is. She would be saved, I'm not. So thank God it's not a racist God that only has it for one nation of people. What it does say in very clarity is that God chose the Jews through which the Messiah could come. Once the Messiah comes, and he did, and you know who his name is, Al-Masihu, it is Isa, it is Jesus. What did Jesus say in Matthew 28, 19 and 20? Now take this message and starting in Jerusalem to Judea, to Galilee, to the whole world, preach the gospel in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's why all of us now are included. He's not a racist God. He includes all people, starting with Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, and to the whole world, and that includes you too, Michael. You are now included if you just accept Jesus. As the prophet God who did come, yes, he was a prophet, but he was much greater than the prophet. He was God himself. He died on the cross for you, rose again for you. If you just accept that, you're a part of the kingdom of God. There's nothing racist about it. Even you from Kerala.
No, I'm not from Kerala.
Oh, you're not from Kerala. I thought you were.
I'm from India. India is, is a big country.
I love India. That's my birthplace.
See, I can assure you, Jay, there is nothing that can convince me that the Quran is not from God. I test the message and it is indeed the word of God. And let me tell you one thing, and you're saying that just because Muhammad is not from the prophetic line, that doesn't, make him, false prophet. Jesus,
he's a false prophet to me. And I have to go on that, Michael. I have to go with what my Bible says.
I understand that. To me, Jesus, see, Quran, exalts Jesus. Prophet Muhammad confirms the message of Jesus.
When he does not let him get on the cross, he does not exalt him. When he says that he's nothing, he's not the Son of God, he does not exalt him. When he sits there and spends his whole time denying his divinity and spends his whole time in his childhood doing crazy things that I don't recognize. That's not Jesus.
Son of God never meant to be divine, and even Jews don't believe that. The Jews don't believe in human sacrifice. And what do you say about this, John? And even in India, they were traditions. They believe sacrificing a small baby will take away my sins, because they consider the blood of a baby is pure, sinless. It's very similar to the concept of human sacrifice in Christianity. Even Christianity,
please be careful. It would be heinous to think that anybody's sacrifice would take away my sins, and I would agree with you. That is heinous. We're not talking about anybody's. We're talking about God's sacrifice. There's a huge difference between God and me. Please, between God and a child, between God and any infant. Please do not equate God with a human. Please don't do that. Because we're not here sacrificing people. It is God who voluntarily came and sacrificed himself in order to take away the sin of the world. There had to be bloodshed. There had to be life given. And that's in Leviticus chapter 17. If you just read the Bible, it all fits to a piece. That sacrifice did happen. It happened through God who took on human form, and he had to be a human, but not just any human. He had to be God who was human, and only that sacrifice that eradicates all the sin. Until you understand what sin has done, Michael, you will not understand why there had to be bloodshed, why there had to be life given. Until you read the Bible and see the whole scope of what was needed to eradicate sin. You can't just forgive it by saying, I forgive you. There has to be a penalty, and that penalty is life. But it's not just any life. It's not your life. It's not my life. It's not a little child's life. It is God himself. Only that sacrifice will suffice.
And
I hope you listen to what I'm saying, because what I've just said right now is the whole foundation of Christianity right there.
Yeah. And you're saying that God, sacrificing himself is the greatest, sacrifice, right?
What a sacrifice. What a
Yeah.
God we
And
does your
and if
God
that
even come close to that? Does your God even know what that's all about?
the fact that we are alive, the fact that we are speaking today is enough for me to believe in God. I don't need God to come in the form of a man. God does not need to prove his love for us. The fact that he has created us is a firm belief for a believer to know that God loves us. And one of the name in the Quran for God is Al Wadud, which means the loving one. We don't believe God coming in the form of a man and sacrifice. That is, you're reducing.
Allah ever done anything for you?
Sorry?
Where has Allah ever personified Al-Wadud? Where is love of Allah when he never comes to earth? He never talks to you. He never walks with you. He's incapable of and entering time and space. If your God is Allah, then I would suggest not only do you have the wrong God, but he does not even fulfill his name. Al-Wadud is a beautiful name. But I only see true love. See, true love, by definition, does what's best for the other, even to the point of dying for the other. That's the highest expression of love right there. And I thank God that my God has done just that. Where has Allah ever done that? Come on home. What a God we've got. Because he actually personifies what Al-Wadud is all about.
Jay, I invite you to come to Quran, and it's the faith of Jesus was the Islam, that is submission to God's will. The very fact
to Yahweh, not to Allah. I want nothing.
Yahweh is just a name for God in a regional language.
No, this is his universal name.
God does not need identity. God does not need identity. I need to identify you, whereas we don't need to. God is known through his attributes.
Allah can be anybody. Generic. The fact that your God is a pagan God, that it's a Nabatean God, that you've had to borrow from polytheistic environment, proves to me he's not the Bible. And that's why I want to say to you, Michael, come back to a God who dies for you. Come on back to a God who loves you so much that the great God who made the heavens and the earth is willing to come as a little baby and to die even for you. Michael,
Jay,
even for you.
If you come from India, right? You're born in India. I can stump you on that because see, in India, people, even the Christians in India, call God as in different language. They don't call Yahweh. They don't even include Yahweh in their praise. They use their local language. Yeah.
Michael, why are my parents in England? Why are my grandparents? I'm a third generation Indian. My family started to go to India in 1913. We've been there over 100 years. And the reason why my grandparents went to India, why my father was born there, he died there, my grandfather died there, my mother died there. They all lived and died there for one reason, so that they could show the real God, not these 3 million gods. They needed to know who real God was, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The only
you're mistaken, Jay.
Which is in that pantheon of 3 million gods. They're missing.
Don't believe in 3 million gods. You are reducing Hinduism to just one sect. There are the Hindus believe in one God who can take infinite number of forms. They don't believe in 3 million gods. You are being unfair to Hindus. Hindus don't believe in 3 million gods. Nobody does. What
Michael,
they believe,
there are 3 million that have been last counted. Now Brahma would be the eternal, the creator God, and Brahma is not is certainly not Yahweh. They're nothing. But I'm not here to talk about Hinduism. I'm not even here to talk about India. I think we need to get back to the historical. Do you have any historical questions that we've been dealing with tonight?
Yeah, I have one question which is related to Jesus.
No, on this material. Keep to this material. Try to keep to the historical questions. What are some problems? Did you notice we pretty much confronted everything about how your religion began historically, using material that is extra Quranic and extra Islamic, using material that you can get your hand on. Do you have any questions about that?
Yeah, I have one thing to say about history. History is, currently the Christians, the Western world is in power. They control pretty much everything. Whichever the empire rules for the current time, they're the ones who are gonna control the sources. They can change. There is a saying: history can be changed by any empire. The past history can be wiped out. In Islam, we don't base our faith in history alone. History is man-made. History is not 100%, and history is not a revelation. Quran is a revelation, and the message of the Quran is objective and it's universal and it stands the test of time. And I invite you, Jay, to come back home.
Michael, it doesn't stand the test of time. We haven't got into the Quran tonight. Otherwise, that would be a whole nother subject, maybe for another webinar. But it certainly does not stand the test of time. We wait till we get to that. It's certainly not universal. It's for the Arab people, an Arab book for the Arab people in the Arab language. And to even read it, I'm told by every Muslim, I have to know Arabic. My Bible can be read by anybody. Oh, it's in 2,500 languages. 93% of the world's population now can read the Bible in their own tongue. Now you tell me, which is the more universal book, the Bible or the Quran? The fact that you can only read the Quran in one language to understand it proves to me it's only for Arabs. And it's not for you, an Indian. So come on back to the universal book, the real book, the only book that can speak to you, because God speaks to you even in your own language.
We believe the importance of the original language. We are not like Christians. I mean, I'm not here to offend Christians. Christians, they're not concerned about the original language. We don't say Quran cannot be understood in when it is translated in English. We don't say that. See, what happens is, if your original language is lost, the meaning is also lost as well. Because see, just the ancient if I read
right there, Michael, if that's the case, why is it that the Bible can be understood in all 2,500 languages? Why is it you can understand from Genesis all the way to Revelation in all 2,500 languages what the Bible means?
That's not correct.
If that were the case, no, you can. And now, why is it that we don't have to go back to the Hebrew and Greek? None of us, I don't know Hebrew or Greek, but I can understand every verse. The reason is because the Bible is made for everyone.
Let me tell you, Jay, one thing. In India,
that the Quran is universal, and yet you're telling me that you have to speak Arabic to really understand it. Even
I didn't say that.
Even the Arab Muslim scholars can't understand 20% of it. Now that shows me that it's nothing more than a man-made document. We could prove that in another webinar. We don't have time to do that tonight. But thanks for your question. It's good. I don't agree with you. We're going to have to agree to disagree on this one.
Yeah, I have one last question. And I'll go.
Okay, go ahead.
And you said, right, that Christians can, have understood the message in different languages. I can assure you the very basic concept of Trinity is not understood.
Michael, I'm going to ask you to actually keep questions on topic. I'm going to put you back in the viewer section because all your questions have been off topic, and we want to really focus on the origins of Islam and not the Trinity and not the New Testament this evening. Let me bring up...
John, you and I can understand the Trinity quite well, can't we? Both in English and in any other language.
Indeed.
Okay. Next question.
Okay, so we have Jamala up. Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead, Jamala.
Hello.
Hello. Jamal, hi.
Okay. My question to Jay: Do you agree that Quran has a nice melody? Because important Muslims import believing Muhammad and to my understanding, is his imaginary Allah is based on Quran, and it has a nice melody. And I agree with that Quran has a nice melody and is a very summarized idea about the total Bible, which has a 66 book. So how it was generated, and Muhammad did not write Quran, and neither he proved that his Allah dropped the Quran in the cave where he was meditating. But I know that the Caliph Uthman, he produced the Quran after around 27 years after death of Muhammad. So, but this thing is, it is interesting that charm millions of Muslims because of reason of Quran. So how it was developed? Do you have any idea?
Thank you, Jamal. That's a very good question, and it is really part of the historical argument. So I thank you for asking something that is to do with history. When you look at the cadence, the beautiful cadence that we hear about, and I hear many Muslims say this, that when you listen to the Quran, the cadence is just beautiful. Listen, I grew up in India. I grew up in an area that was surrounded by Muslims. I was in northern India, where there's about 180 million Muslims. It's the third largest Muslim population on earth. So I have grown up with Muslims all my time. I've heard the imams. I've heard the call to prayers. I've heard the recitations. I hear it in my taxis. When I was growing up, it would be coming out of the radios, pumping out all the time. And after a while, it's true. Out of familiarity, it is beautiful. And I agree with you, Jamal. At times I miss it. There are times when I miss not hearing the call to prayer and the beautiful recitations that are coming out of the Quran. No one suggests that there is not beautiful poetry there. Here's the problem. Did it come from Muhammad? Did Muhammad have anything to do with it? There are two scholars, Syriac scholars, one from Germany named Dr. Gunther Lulling, who did a study on the beautiful poetry that's in the Quran. And there is poetry in the Quran. And he, independent of another scholar named Luxemburg, both of them looked at these poems, this poetic verse. And they noticed that they had seen this before. Independent of each other, they went back and they noticed that every one of these poems that are in the Quran, that you call to be sonorous and beautiful and heavenly, that every one of these poems, strophe for strophe, could be traced back to pre-Islamic Christian hymns written in Syriac by the Syriac churches, taken from the Syriac and interposed into the Arabic. So if you're going to give credit to Muhammad for such beautiful recitations and beautiful poetry and beautiful strophes, then I would give credit to people that wrote it. Don't give credit to Muhammad. We haven't had a chance to say whether Muhammad had anything to do with the Quran, but don't even give credit to the Arabs that supposedly copied it down, because these were all copied. They were copied from these Syriac hymns written in the 5th and 6th century, taken from these hymns, and they are beautiful. Look at the hymns we have today, and interposed and slapped into the Quran. Remember, much of the Quran is borrowed from other sources. There are myriads of stories in the Quran that come from Jewish apocryphal writings, from Christian sectarian writings, and including this poetry comes from Christian this Syriac writings, Christian Syriac hymns. Now, you may love it, and I do love it. I myself agree that sometimes I miss it, but there's lots of music that I love. Look at Handel's Messiah. My goodness, it brings tears to my eyes when I listen to it. But I would not say, because of the fact that I love Handel's Messiah, that must be written by God or that it comes from some divine sources. I don't think any of Shakespeare's sonnets. You listen to Shakespeare's sonnets. There's nothing in the English language that is more beautiful. But no one would suggest, therefore, that it is divine, any more than the Quran, which has borrowed these beautiful Christian hymns, beautiful stories, and some of them are apocryphal writings, Jewish and Christian. Give credit to the Jews and Christians that wrote it, but don't give credit to Muhammad. And don't suggest, therefore, that the Quran is a divine book on that premise.
But it is interesting that even the kids can remember the whole book. Don't you agree?
There are many people that memorize many pieces of literature, and especially if you believe that it's going to give you barakah, if it's going to give you divine blessing, then of course there's an incentive to memorize it. Even in England, we have many young children that are forced to memorize it from the age of 3 years old. And all over the world, Muslim world, from the time they're 3, they're forced to go to these Quranic schools and memorizing. And you can see them going back and forth. All my life, I've seen these young kids memorize it. That's not because they love it. It's because they have to do it, because their parents force them to do it. And we know of certain ones that are prodigies. Said Qutb, the great writer in the last century, he had memorized the Quran by the time he was 10 years old. That doesn't prove it's divine, right? And it doesn't prove that it even has any divine sonority. It just means the boy's a prodigy. If you believe that this is going to give you divine barakah, divine blessing, then you also will memorize it. We don't have to earn off our blessing. We don't have to, in Christianity, memorize the Bible. We have it written down in a language you can understand. That's why we don't force people to memorize it. We don't force our children to memorize it and have these competitions on television to show how much they can know and then clap and applaud for them. We don't force that. For me, it's a waste of time. I would rather read the Bible in my own language, have it right in front of me so that I can read it at any time, at any place, anywhere, with anybody, in any language. That shows me the Bible's a lot better for me than your Quran would be for you. Because even those people that memorize it, remember, 85% of the Muslims in the world today do not read Arabic. And yet hundreds and thousands of them are memorizing in the Arabic language, because you have to memorize it in Arabic. Why in the world are you memorizing a book you don't even understand? I have a friend here in London who his name was Ishmael. He had memorized the entire Quran, all 114 surahs. And I remember I would play the Mickey on him, and every once in a while I would ask him, all right, tell me, Surah 2, Ayah 145. And he'd stop and think, and he'd get it word for word. And I said, okay, what have you just said? He said, I have no idea what I've said. What a waste of time. What a waste of time.
You are saying, in other words, any human being, if they want, children can remember Shakespeare's sonnet, right? I don't remember any single word, but if the children have been taught since childhood, they can remember anything.
That's right. They can remember the entire Shakespeare sonnets. And there are people who have memorized it. We know of people who have memorized the entire Bible. But we don't sit and say you have to memorize it to receive blessing, to receive your salvation, to work off your salvation. Thank God that's not how we get saved. We get saved by one way and one name, and his name is Jesus Christ. He has already done it for us. Now, we do have the Bible. Every one of us has the Bible so that we can use it, open it, read it in any language we know. And that's why I love the Bible I have in my hand. I don't have to have it in my head. I can read it in any language, anywhere, at any time. Come on home.
Yeah, that's what I like to give my short comment about the Bible. Is Bible 66 book, but it speaks the same message from Genesis to the Revelation, whereas in Quran, I find it is very disappointing, contradicting. Sometimes Prophet Muhammad says, "You read Bible." Again, he says it's been manipulated. So that's what is to me, at least to my understanding about Quran, that it has the problem in believing the book that's sent by the Holy God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and father of Jesus Christ. Thanks.
I'm glad you said Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Ishmael has nothing to do with that line. So you're already coming on board. But I'm also interested that you said, Jamal, that when the Quran is full of contradictions and it's very difficult to understand, when you put these two books up side by side and you look at them, there's no comparison. When you look at the Bible, it is altogether different than the Quran. The Quran does not have any complete stories except one. There's only one complete story in the entire Quran, and that's the story of Joseph in Surah 12. The Bible is full of complete stories. Every story is complete. They begin, they end, one follows another. And that's why anybody can read the Bible. That's why I said we don't need to memorize it. Just read the Bible. Keep it with you. Put it under your pillow. If you want to memorize it, fine. But you don't need salvation by memorizing the Bible. But when you do it and you look at these books, see, the Quran even gives credit to the Bible. The Quran says over and over again, if you have any question, Jamal, come back to the Bible. Come back to the Tawrat and the Injil, for they are signs for you. In Surah 4, Ayah 136, it says that. In Surah 10, Ayah 94, if you have any question, Jamal, according to Surah 10, Ayah 96, and Surah 21, Ayah 7, go back to the Tawrat and Injil. Come back to this book. The Quran is telling you to come back to this book. Surah 29, Ayah 46 says, don't even dispute with me on this. Don't dispute with the Christian, because we have been given the Tawrat and the Injil for you. In Surah 5, Ayah 46 and 47, and verse 68, it says very clearly, O Christians, that's me, and Jews, go back to those scriptures God has given us. That's the Tawrat in the Injil, the Old and the New Testament, the books of Moses and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's why, Jamal, we are coming to you tonight. Said, forget, this book is so hard to understand. It does not make sense. It does not have complete stories. It's borrowed from many other sources, and the sources it's borrowed from are not the authentic sources. This book has no borrowed books. It is all authentic. It does make sense, and it tells you exactly how to meet God. You said it is not contradictory, that it all has one theme. And I agree with you, Jamal. The theme behind this entire book, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, is Jesus Christ. It all
So, Jay, did you read the whole Quran from what? First book is Surah Bukhari, and what is the last book of Quran? I forgot. Did you read the whole book? And can you tell in a nutshell how it was processed? I mean, like I understand the Bible is Genesis to the Revelation. It is a historical, or not. I mean, the historian won't believe that, but to me, I believe it. But what is the what is the what sequences? I can say the first book, not the book, is the surah.
Fatiha, the Fatiha to An-Nas. From the Fatiha to An-Nas. That's from the first surah, Fatiha, to An-Nas, which would be 114. Take a look and see if you can make sense of much of it. Take a look and see if it flows. Take a look and see if it uplifts you. Take a look and see if it answers your need. And then look and see how much of it, especially in the Medinan surahs, the first 20 surahs, all have to do with Muhammad and not with you and me. That's why I love the Bible, because it has to do with everyone. It has certainly to do with you, Jamal, and it can take you back to Jesus Christ. The Bible was sent by God, written by men, inspired by the Holy Spirit, 66 books, written in over 1,400 years on 3 continents, in 3 different languages, and can be translated into every language so that you, Jamal, can know who God is and know who Jesus is. This book is for you. It is relevant today, the day it was written, today as much as it is relevant the day it was written. That's why I love the Bible. Please, please, please come back and read the Bible. Then come back and tell me how great it is.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the time.
You're welcome, Jamala. Let me bring up Akil. Hi, Akil.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay.
Good.
Mr. Smith, how are you?
How are you? Akil is your name?
Yes.
Itharul.
Say it again?
It says here, Itharul. Haq.
Oh, Izharul Haq is the title, which means the truth manifests.
Okay. How are you doing?
I'm pretty sure you know that title already, right? Izharul Haq.
There you go. I know Haq. I didn't know Itharul, but I know Haq.
Izharu from Zahara, Izhar. Manifest, to manifest, to make apparent.
Excuse me for my
you studied the Quran, so I was supposed you have to know these terminologies, right? Izhar, Allah says in Quran, yuridu, that they desire to put out the light of Allah. Allah will make light his word. Allah will manifest it. Izhar, to manifest the truth.
What's your question? Okay,
I missed some of the show earlier, but I had a few questions for you about the historical facts of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I know you argue against his history and him being a real individual, as well as the idea of the Quran originating from anyone other than him as a transmitter and coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if I can get
that real quickly, let me just jump in there. Okay, I don't say that he isn't historical. He is historical. I do believe he existed. So you weren't here when we were talking about that. What I argue against is the classical account, the account that he was born in 570, moved from a place called Mecca to Medina in 622, received revelation from 610 to 622, that called the Meccan revelation, then received another set of revelation from 622 to 632 in Medina, and then died in 632, and somehow the Quran then was put together about 20 years later. That's what I was arguing about. Not that he didn't exist. Yes, he did exist. But is he the man that received the Quran? No, I don't believe that. Is he the man that even lived in Mecca? No, I don't believe that.
So on what accounts are you basing this on? I mean, what history are you showing us to date exactly when he was or when he wasn't? What history are you proving to show that when the Quran actually came into existence? What evidence or proof you're showing that the Quran came from Syriac hymns? I mean, what do you have to substantiate your claims other than preaching?
Okay, you weren't here for the first, probably, I don't know when you came in onto the talk, but at the very beginning, for the first half hour, what I did is I looked at the earliest references we do have to Muhammad. And there is no source from within Arab sources of this man named Muhammad until 691. And he died in 632. So for 60 years, we don't have any reference to him within Arab sources. That's fascinating, because if he is the God, if he is the prophet of Islam, why is it that the Muslims don't even know about it? But here's the other problem. You weren't here when I looked at it. We don't have any reference to people called Muslims. We don't have any reference to a religion called Islam. We don't have any reference to a book called the Quran at all until the late 7th century. He died in the early 7th century. But we do have references to him outside of Arab sources. We have the Doctrina Iacobi, written in 634. That refers to him by name. We have the writings of Sabaeus, written in 660, which talk about it and warn the Christians about him. So he is a person. No one suggests, I don't suggest that he didn't exist. Yes, he did. But he's not the man that Muslims would like us to believe. And the fact that he was introduced by Abd al-Malik in 691 on the Dome of the Rock, that's the first time we see his name introduced in Arab reference courses, also on the coins that were introduced in 692, and also on the caliphal protocols that were introduced in 691. 3 different sources from within Arab sources that he's finally introduced 60 years after supposedly he died is curious in and of itself. The fact
but Jay, why should I be curious when, I mean, the Arabs, first and foremost, at that time, they wasn't a people of reading or writing. It wasn't until Islam came that they became a people of writing. So it took them some time to develop and record their history, but you have records from early on from the Sahaba, you have hadith early on, you have Quran transmission early on, you have narrations, biography early on that was compiled, not written down, but were compiled later to prove the existence or the history of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But to say 60 years had elapsed and the Arabs didn't have any history of writing, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself said that we are ummah, that we don't read or we don't calculate. So it took them some time to compile the history, but 60 years is a short time.
Let me answer that. Let me answer that very quickly. Now, you say that they didn't read or write very early on. That's not true. You know very good and well that there is Zayd ibn Thabit. Who is Zayd ibn Thabit? He was a secretary of Muhammad. How could he not read and write if he's a secretary?
Not everybody, Jay Smith, not everybody.
Okay. Who wrote the Quran down at the time of Abu Bakr in 634? If the Quran is written down in 634, that Quran was written on something. It had to be a record if it is the Quran. So don't tell me they couldn't read or write. More than that, it's your traditions. Now I'm saying it's your traditions that tell me that it was given to Hafsa, the wife of the Prophet. She would then put it under her bed for 20 years. By the time Uthman comes to power in 646, around 650, he then is he is told that he must get a formalized or a canonized Quran, and then he has Zayd ibn Thabit take Hafsa's copy out again. This is your tradition telling me this. Now, what is this thing if it's not written down? It's a book. If you're writing down, you're writing on something. And then he is to take that and make it into a canonized form. Along with Zubair, Alas, and Nahari, the 4 of them rewrite the Quran according to Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509 and 510. And then Uthman then burns all the other manuscripts. What are these manuscripts if these are not written down? So don't tell me they couldn't read or write. More than that, Akil. We do know that Muhammad's death, 642, the Arabs had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Are you telling me that no one could read or write in Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo? That there were no libraries there? That people were illiterate? Please, no one would suggest that. By the time that Abd al-Malik comes to power, Spain in the west, India in the east. Listen to me, Akil. That means from Spain to India, by the time of the end of the 7th century, you're trying to tell me that nobody could read or write in all that swath of land. Now, there were libraries in every one of these cities. So please don't say they did not read or write.
That's not what I'm saying, Jason Smith. And please don't exaggerate or misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm saying during the time of Prophet Muhammad in his locality, it wasn't the normal for people to be literate. There were exceptions, obviously. There were people who could read and write. But it was the normal. It was an oral culture. And you have to know, I mean, you're a man of history, you have to know about oral culture. The dominant status of oral culture is that people don't read or write. But there are exceptions to the rule. And there are people who could read and write, and that's why he has scribes. But everybody wasn't that literate to know how to read and write. So please don't exaggerate the point and make it seem like I'm saying everybody in the history cannot read or write. And that's not what I'm saying.
It's an oral culture, but be careful about oral cultures. If you're going to depend on oral cultures, what happens with oral cultures? You know very well that when you say one thing to one person, you pass it on orally. By the time, even within 15 minutes, the first person and the last person that says something do not agree. If that can happen in 15 minutes, can you imagine what would happen over 18 years? So please be careful. Do not trust oral culture. I don't trust oral culture. You should trust oral culture. And your Quran, even your traditions don't trust oral culture, because that's why they had to write it down. Why is it that they had to write it down immediately in Abu Bakr's time? Because so many of those who had memorized it had died in the Battle of Yamama. Your own traditions tell me that. So even your traditions tell me that they wrote it down. So I'm not exaggerating. I'm saying, where is those writings? Where are those manuscripts?
Okay. This is it. To that point. First and foremost, in terms of oral culture, the Quran is quite different. I mean, you gave a whole spiel on how the kids from early age memorize the Quran, and you hear them memorize the Quran. So just as they did now, they did it then. The Quran is not a story that you narrate to somebody and 15 minutes later it's changed. No, the Muslims from very early on believed it was the word of God, and they treated it as such, that they very meticulously recited it as it was dictated to them, and you to yourself is your own testification for this. You see it in the land you lived in your own time. You've seen it, how the Quran is meticulously transmitted from one stage to another. It happens now as it happened back then to the people who received the Quran from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In terms of Uthman burning the manuscripts, let me
answer that. You can come back to you. Listen, that's very true. There's no doubting that today they did memorize it, and we know what they memorized because we have the Quran in our hands. So if you have memorized it, I can look it up to make sure that you are agreeing with the Quran written down in my hands. What did they have in the 7th century? What Quran are you talking about? Where is there any manuscript that is complete and unchanged from the 7th century? Look at all the major manuscripts, Akil. Look at the Topkapi, look at the Samarkand, look at the Husseini, look at the Ma'il Quran, look at the Petropolitan Quran, look at the Sana. Those are the 6 major manuscripts that you have in the Muslim world. They are the earliest Qurans. Not one of them is complete. They are not written from the 7th century. They are from the 8th century and the 9th century. They do not agree with each other, and they don't even agree completely with the Quran we have today. So don't tell me that they memorized, they all had the same memorization, because I don't even know what they memorized. You can't even come up with one Quran that is complete and unchanged from the 7th century to show me what they memorized. I can tell you what they memorized today, the Hafs Quran that was canonized in 1924. But even the 1924 Hafs Quran, we have 24 other Qurans that exist today, even in the Arabic Qurans that exist today here in the present century. That's why I'm saying, even today, you can't tell me what they memorized. You have the Hafs Quran because it's the one that is the primary one here in Britain and also in the West. But in North Africa, you have the Warsh Quran. There are hundreds of differences between the Warsh and the Hafs. So even the Arabic Qurans are not the same. So be careful when you say that they all memorized it. What did they memorize? That's all I'm asking. Because you can't get the manuscript to prove it that they were all memorizing the same thing.
No problem, Jay. That, you know what I'm saying, that the issue point. Now, let me take it back to you. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Did you know what I just say?
Yes, yeah.
What they memorized.
I'm addressing that point. I'm answering.
Tell me, because you made the claim that they all memorized the same Quran we have today. What Quran did they memorize?
I'm answering the question. You let me answer the question? Can I answer?
Yeah, go ahead, Akil. Answer the question.
Okay, now, the Quran that was given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and given to his companions, the same exact Quran that was written down at the time of Abu Bakr and was taken and rewritten down at the time of Uthman ibn Affan. That Quran, with its variances that came from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was the Quran that we have today.
How do you know?
Let's listen. Because we may not have a 100% full manuscript to take back there, that's no problem for the Muslims. Because first and foremost, the Quran. Let me answer, Mr. Smith. Let me answer.
You admit that there were variations. Bothers me because
can I answer?
Memorizing.
Go ahead, Akil.
Allow me to answer. I didn't interrupt you. You answered. I didn't interrupt you. Because there are variances in the Quran, there's no problem with there being variances in the Quran, because the Prophet Muhammad said something quite clear in the Hadith, mentioned that there were variances in the Quran. He mentioned there was a narration, Umar ibn Khattab had memorized a surah for the Quran from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He heard a man recite it in a way different from how it was taught to him. He took the man to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said, he's reciting the Quran in a way different from how I memorized it. First and foremost, it shows us the seriousness they took about the Quran and making sure it was exactly how it came down to them. So the Prophet Muhammad said, Umar, you recite. And he recited. And he told the man to recite. And he recited. He said, both of you are correct because the Quran has came down with different ahruf. The Quraysh had different dialects and the Quran had came down. So for instance, in Surah Al-Baqarah, you read, yukadhibun wa yakdhibun. You have those variances in somewhere. In the Quraysh dialect, they don't have what's called imala. So for instance, you say mu'minun or mu'minun. You say wadduha or wadduhay. It's all Quran. It's the same thing. Yadashidun. So this is, you have a problem with that, but that's the history. We have narrations, verification. Moreover, I sat with teachers who have memorized the Quran from memory. I mean, the way you know your name, the way you know your house, and they can narrate the Quran, not only the whole of it, but every single person that transmitted it from themselves all the way back to the 7th century to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, unbroken chain. I can bring you multiple scholars, that can give you the Quran, unbroken, oral transmission, back to the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now, about oral transmission.
Wait. Let Jay respond. Go ahead, Jay.
Can you see, Akil, you have now admitted that there were variations in the original text. And then you want to tell me that suddenly it has unbroken narration all the way back. But you're quoting, everything you quoted to me right now comes from Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, from Ibn Hisham. That's 2 to 240 years after the fact. You weren't here at the beginning of the talk. I confronted that. You aren't aware of that. Everything you're going to quote about how the Quran was put together, how Islam began, who Muhammad was, what he said, what he did, is all coming from 200 to 300 years after the fact. I don't trust it because it's all based on oral tradition. And you now admit that there has been an oral transmission from today all the way back. What oral transmission that exists prior to the 9th century? Where is this oral tradition that exists prior to the century? And when you say it's oral, how can you prove anything? It's nothing more than hearsay. And you're basing everyththing you believe on nothing more than hearsay. I want to see the manuscripts. I want to see the Quran that you talk about that supposedly was put together at the time of Uthman in 652. And I want to see the 9 volumes because it went to every province. There were 9 provinces. That means 9 Qurans that are complete and unchanged from the time of Uthman. Show me even one, and you can. And I say that's the reason why we're even having this debate. That's why we're talking about the historicity. Because of the fact that you make these claims based on traditions that are 200 to 300 years later, you cannot find me an oral tradition that goes back from the 21st century back to the 7th century. You can't even find one that goes past the 10th century. I would suggest that it's nothing more than hearsay. If you could come up and show me this original Quran, supposedly given to a man named Muhammad, supposedly compiled during the time of Abu Bakr, supposedly canonized at the time of Uthman. Now we're talking about 652, just one copy of that Quran. Then I would start to believe you. The fact that you can't suggests to me that the Qurans you do have, and I named them the 6 ones that you have, and there's another 4 that come after, but the 6 major ones, none of them are from the century your prophet lived. They do not come from Uthman. Even your Muslim scholars have now admitted it. They are not complete. And the one that is the best amongst them, the top copy, is from 100 years after your prophet. And it has 2,270 variants from the Quran we have today. So when did this Quran come into being? When was it finally canonized? I will tell you the date. It was canonized in 1924. That's less than 100 years ago. That is not oral tradition that goes back 1,400 years. That doesn't even go back 100 years. Thanks for your time, Akhil. It's been great. I love your passion. Keep it up.
Okay, let's move on to how long do you have, Jay? Are you need to wrap up pretty soon, or?
I have about another 20 minutes.
Okay. We currently don't have any hands raised, but we do have questions submitted. So let me go through some of those. And if anyone wants to raise their hand for some last questions and interaction with Jay, then please go ahead. Nehemiah says, Jay, you say that we can't find Muhammad mentioned before 692. The Quran mentions Muhammad. Does that mean we don't have Quranic manuscripts before 692?
Thank you, Nehemiah. You hit it on the head. I hope that has now been answered by what I just said to Akhil. Now we've not really got into the Quran today. We haven't. That maybe John, we could do that at a later time. Come back again and just unpack the Qurans, because this is probably the Achilles heel of Islam right here. Mecca and the Quran. Those are the two that are going to kill Islam historically. Have you noticed no one's dealt with Mecca tonight? None of the Muslims could deal with Mecca tonight. They all are going to the Quran. You can see why. And when I introduced Mecca back in 1994 with Jamal Badawi, who was considered at that time to be the foremost scholar in the Quran, on the Quran, in the Islamic world, in the English language, he could not deal with those 10 criticisms. It's fascinating to me that nobody, I mean nobody, can really deal with Mecca. They cannot deal with the Qibla. They cannot deal with, to me, which is absolutely astounding, they only want to talk about the Quran. But you hear what the claims that even Aqil made. Aqil started by saying, it is completely the same Quran that we have today that was revealed to the Prophet that exists in heaven. Then he had to realize that he couldn't say that there are variations. He admitted that there were variations. Not only that there were variations, when I asked him, can you show me one manuscript that predates the 8th century, he couldn't come up with one. And he had to fall back, well, we memorized it. If therefore it was memorized. But what did they memorize? He didn't answer that question. And so, not Nehemiah, the difficulty is, since there are no Qurans at all until they don't even begin to appear to after the time of Abd al-Malik, and the ones that possibly may predate the 8th century, like these folios, the folio that suddenly came into light in July of last year here in Birmingham, even that folio, the date on that is 568 to 645, according to carbon dating. The carbon dating of that is a 77-year stretch that predates Muhammad, is 2 years before Muhammad was even born, and comes 7 years before the Quran was even written down. So even that date is problematic. But that's not the only problem, Nehemiah. When you look at the carbon datings, that's not the only manuscript that's been carbon dated. We now have the Sana manuscript that was discovered in 1975. They have now been carbon dating that not only in Arizona, they have also been carbon dating that in Lyon in France. The carbon dating that they've come up with those manuscripts go right back to 443 AD. Up until 543 AD. That's the 5th and 6th century. That comes up even before Muhammad or the Quran or Islam even began. I would suggest that there's such a multiplicity and the dates are all over the place because of the problems of carbon dating. I would suggest that we're probably going to have to throw out all of these carbon dates unless they are proven to be accurate. If they are accurate, look and see what we're finding. We're finding that even these carbon dated Qurans only refer to borrowed material. The Birmingham Folio, Surah 18, Surah 19, and Surah 20. Take a look at those 3 surahs. That's the story of Dhul Qarnayn, who is Alexander the Great, the story of the 7 sleepers, and the story of Moses, all of which are borrowed stories. We know where they're borrowed from. We know what manuscripts, we even know what documents they come from. We know where they come from, and all the stories that they're borrowed from predate the 7th century. These are not only Jewish apocryphal writings, they are also part of the biblical text, at least the story of Moses. But it doesn't get it right in every time. And these would be pre-Islamic, pre-Quranic, and pre-Muhammad. If these are proven to be correct, I would suggest these are the original the original Arab borrowed stories from the apocryphal accounts and the sectarian writings that then get interposed and put into the Quran. But I'm not going to put my name on that. What I would suggest is that we're going to probably have to throw out the Birmingham Folios, these carbon dating dates, because they are so inexact, and stay with the paleographical studies. The paleographical dates are much more sure, they're much more authentic, and they make much more sense. So the paleographic studies, the paleographic dates that we have for the earliest manuscripts show that even the Sana manuscript has underwritings, has an underscript, what they call a palimpsest. And the underscript, which is written probably in the last 2 decades of the 7th century, does not agree with the upper script, which is dated to 705, early 8th century. So you have a difference already between 690 and 705. That's the time of Abd al-Malik. And it looks like what we're going to probably, this is still in its infancy, what we're probably going to come to a conclusion is that much of the Quran was compiled from the time of Abd al-Malik, brought together from other sources that predate it, yes, because if it's borrowed, it predates the Quran. Probably Nabatean sources, a lot of it is Syriac sources. Much of it is stories that are Judeo-Christian stories. Dhul Qarnayn would be outside of that. The 7 sleepers would be outside of that. compiled and put together. There were different schools of Quranic writings. You have Ubay ibn Ka'b, who became an author of a codex that became very popular in Damascus. You have Ibn Masud, who became the author of another codex that became popular in Baghdad. You have Ibn Musa, who became the author of a codex, became popular in Basra. And then you have Zayd ibn Thabit, who became another author of another codex that became popular in Medina. So you have 4 different cities. These are known as the metropolitan codices, referred to enormously in the traditions that come in the 9th and 10th century, referring how they disagree. How that one has 2 extra surahs. Others, like Ibn Musa or Ibn Ubay ibn Ka'b, is missing 2 surahs. And that's why we're finding out that the later writers in the 9th and 10th century did not consider the earliest Qurans to be complete or authoritative or all in agreement. And that's why it's fascinating that we're now seeing this coming out of the manuscript evidence. Dan Brubaker's material, his doctoral thesis, when he looked at 10 of the earliest Qurans, the 6 that I mentioned and 4 others, when he looked at their manuscripts and he took pictures of all of them, he came up with hundreds upon hundreds of corrections, variations, insertions, deletions, erasers, coverings, tapings, hundreds of these. And these are all consonantal differences. These are not vowelizations. These are not diacritical marks. This is not the Dagger Aleph that, like many of the Muslims at the Speaker's Corner claim these are. These are consonantal texts, which means they change the meaning of the text. And these corrections continue on Nehemiah up until the 9th century. So I would suggest that the Quran itself is a much later rendition. It was put together because they named a prophet in 691. They gave him a name. His name is Muhammad. He was introduced on the Dome of the Rock, introduced on the coins, introduced on the Caliphal protocols. Once you have a prophet, you've got to have a book. That's why Abdul Malik started to compile that book. How did scholars put it together? There was lots of disagreements. Al-Walid is the one that is best known for the earliest manuscripts. He's the son of Abdul Malik. He rose from 705 to 750, and that's when they start to proliferate. And then you get the Samarkand manuscript in Tashkent. It has so many errors. It has so many scribal problems. It is an embarrassment, according to Dr. Tayyar Altukulic, the Turkish scholar, who is he would consider to be the leading authority on the Quranic script. He says, throw it away. It's not throw it away, but it's not worth because it is such an embarrassment. So I would suggest that this is all in its infancy. There's going to be an awful lot of new material that's coming out. It may be good for us to actually look at these manuscripts in another webinar and unpack them and show how the Quran evolved. If we think Islam evolved, wait till you get to the Quran. And it looks like most of the Muslims tonight have spent their time on the Quran. They've already given up on Mecca. They've already given up on Muhammad, and they refuse to give up on the Quran. Listen, that's great, and I'm glad for their passion. I'm glad for the fact that they see that they have to defend it, but they've got to use historical criticism to do it. We've done it with the Bible. We've had 150 years head start. All the criticisms that came out of the Tübingen School, there in Germany, and by Wellhouse and others, I can't think of the hypothesis. Documentary hypothesis, the literary criticism, the historical criticism, redacted criticism, source criticism, all these criticisms that attacked our Bible, decimated the church by 1905. We have now found answers to every one of those criticisms. That's why I love to show the Bible versus the Quran. I love to put these 2 books next to each other. We do it at Speaker's Corner every Sunday. And in every case, this book has answered every one of the historical questions. This book is just beginning to be asked those same questions. And that's why my Bible is bigger than my Quran, for a very good reason, because it's a bigger, the better, the more, not only the more authoritative book, the one that has passed every test. And we're still out there doing the same. Back over to you, John.
Okay, we have a question from Brian who asks, Ibn Ishaq's material with a commentary by Ibn Hisham, 834, in the form of a recension is available and translated into English. Ibn Hisham admitted that he has deliberately omitted some of the stories that were embarrassing to Muslims. Part of these embarrassing stories were salvaged by Tabari, 838 to 923, a prominent and Persian historian and a commentator of the Quran. If Muhammad was a fictional character, why would Islamic sources narrate embarrassing stories of Muhammad, their prophet, unless it is true that he existed? How should we approach Muslims? Should we go with Muhammad was a false prophet, or should we go with Muhammad was not an actual person but a fictional character?
No, that's a great question, Brian. No one suggests that Muhammad is a fictional character. What we're suggesting is he is nothing more than a man of faith, not a man of history. He's not the man of history that we are finding out about. The man of Muhammad that we know in Ibn Hisham, the fact that Ibn Hisham in 833 has to excise and throw out much of Ibn Ishaq, who's writing only in 765. He's only writing a good 70 years earlier. And yet he takes much of Ibn Ishaq and throws it out as embarrassing. Why would it be embarrassing if this is all true? Unless, of course, it's not the right Muhammad. It's not the material that the Abbasids, remember, this is all, much of everything we're talking about is an Abbasid invention. The Abbasid hated the Umayyads. The Umayyads had Muhammad placed in Petra. The Abbasids did not like Petra. We haven't even got into that yet. That's a whole other thing that you need to look at when you look at Dan Gibson's. Go take a look at his documentary. It's brilliant what he does. And he pushes and shows how Umayyads and the Abbasids were at warheads. And the Umayyads were up in Damascus. They were looking towards Petra. They kept on clinging on to Petra, but Petra kept on being destroyed by earthquakes. They finally had to give up Petra. Whereas Zubair, who then confronted the Umayyads, then fled Petra, took the black stone, and then went down to Mecca. And that's why those in Kufa and Wasit then look towards Zubair, and they are the rebels. That is where the beginning of the Abbasid dynasty takes place. And the Abbasids, who hated the Umayyads, then finally destroy the Umayyads, take over Islam, introduce the Abbasid dynasty in 749. And from 749, everything starts to move towards not only Mecca. That's why it's interesting. Mecca, it becomes the majority. It becomes the final place by 822. That Mecca becomes the only place of pilgrimage, the only place that people can pray to. But that's to 822. That's 200 years after the fact. Now, the Abbasids had a problem because everything they knew about Muhammad from the Umayyad period had him up in Petra. And that's why the Quran had already been, certainly much of it had been completed. I'm not saying it was canonized, but the Quran had too much in there. And that's why when you look at the Quran, you can see there's no reference. All the references in the Quran don't fit Mecca, but they can't change the Quran because by the time they come to power in 749, the Topkapi is now becoming the standard. The Topkapi then becomes the standard work. And that's why all the other Qurans are then brought back to the Topkapi as the final one. Once they have standardized the Quran, not canonized it, but starting to standardize it, they can no longer change the Quran. Therefore, what they have to do is they have to change the stories about this man. And they have to bring him out of Petra and bring him down to Mecca. But you can't change the fact that his contact is with these people from Ad and Thamud and Midian that are 600 miles further north. That you can't change. That's why the Quran, in some ways, is probably it's going to destroy them in the long run. The Quran itself, internally, is going to destroy any notion that this man could be from Mecca. Nonetheless, that's why they got the prophet, they now have the book, now they've got to create the story. And the story is finally canonized with Ibn Hisham in 833. He admits that he throws out much of what Ibn Ishaq said. He throws out much of anything the Umayyads had about this man, and they place him in Mecca. That means you've got to have all these stories surround him. Now can you understand why another 40 years later, Abu Bakr is given the task then to take the sayings. But all the sayings, I would suggest, if we could read them, if we still had access to them today, we don't. They've all been destroyed. I would suggest that many of those sayings would have had Muhammad too far north, doing everything up north, up there in Petra, that had a valley, had a stream, had olive trees. There are no olive trees at all in Mecca. There are no olive trees in Arabia. The only olive trees exist around the Mediterranean. That's why Petra makes sense. Now you've got the sayings. They have to put all the sayings together, and that's why he compiles from 600,000, bring it down to 7,397. Can you understand why it's not a conspiracy, it's a destruction of history to create the man, the book, and the place that fits their needs. The Abbasids wanted him in Mecca. That's why pretty much what Islam today is an Abbasid creation. It is not. I hope that helps. Thanks a lot for your question, Brian.
Let's see. Arkson asked, he was linking to a Wikipedia article about the difference between lower script and upper script of the Sana manuscript.
I can answer that very quickly. When you look at a Quran, I have a picture. Let me just show it to you right here. I hope that you can all see this. When you look at the Sana manuscript, you will see that it's a palimpsest. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm. We can see it.
This picture and this picture, the blue one and the brown one. If you look carefully, let me put it as close as I can to the screen. When you look carefully, you will see that it has a script underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the other one. It's under ultraviolet light. Can you see another script that's underneath it?
Yeah, we can see it. Mhm.
That is the defective script. Then what they call the superior and the inferior. The lower script is the inferior text. The upper script is the superior because it's the later. So the superior text is easy to read. When you put it under ultraviolet light, you can then separate the two scripts. And that's what they have done now in, I think it's in Cornell University. They've also done it in the Sorbonne. But Elizabeth Quinn, the wife of Gerd Quinn, who is the one that was given the authority over the Sonnet manuscript in 1981. He's the one that flew down there with von Bothmer and Oleg. The three of them then photographed every page of the Sonnet manuscript. And they're the ones that have spent since 1981. So we're talking about 30, 35 years, 36 years they've been working on it. The wife of Gerd Quinn, who speaks fluent Arabic, is almost as clever as him, well, probably more clever than him, has taken and has separated the two texts. Now, her book is just coming out. It has already been printed in German, and we're waiting for it to be translated to English. We're waiting for her to find out what she has found. What we're understanding is that it's two different texts. But you can see how the Quran evolves from the 690s or 680 to 690, the last 2 decades of the 7th century, to 705, the first decade of the 8th century. This is probably one of the best palimpsests we have to be able to do that. And that's why you can see that the inferior text is probably the nascent Quran, which then becomes the superior text. But even that is changed, because then all through it you will see changes and changes. If you take a look at this paper again, you'll see every time you see an orange mark on the text. If you look here, there's Surah 19. It jumps to Surah 22. Then it has Surah 20 over on the other page, right? The yellow mark. What happened? That 20 should be right where the yellow mark is. Why did it jump? And take a look. If you look carefully, you can see there's two different scripts between these two pages. This over here is 705. This script here is about another 60 years later. So it's late 8th century. This is early 7th century. And when you look at those orange marks, every time you see an orange mark that is put on there by Gerd Quinn and his wife Elizabeth, that is what we call a manuscript variant. That means a word or phrase in that manuscript that does not agree with the 1924 manuscript that we use today, the canonized text, canonized at Al-Azhar University less than 100 years ago by the scholars there. There's about 1,000 of those manuscript variants, they have told me verbally. Now that has not yet been published. We're still waiting for that to be published, but you can see how this is going to rock the Muslim world, because this is showing that the Quran is nothing more than a man-made document. It is not from God. It is not from Muhammad. It is not from the 7th century. It is not even from Uthman, and it's certainly not from Abdul Malik. It looks like it has been changed and changed over the centuries and finally canonized in 1924.
Jehu wanted to ask if one wants to study about Islam and understand from where he should start so that he can defend the gospel and critique Islam.
Who is this?
That was Jehu.
Jehu?
Jehu. Jehu.
Jehu. Oh, good old Jehu from the time of Ahab. He's the one that took over from Ahab. That's a good biblical name. Where should he start? I think, Jehu, the thing you need to do, and I would suggest that you start just by looking at a lot of the debates that are up online. David Wood is a good one to start. Sam Shamoun, I can't think of anybody better than Sam Shamoun. This guy has an eidetic memory. I've never seen anybody that can go faster, knows as much material, retain, and apply everything he knows. Look at his split. Look at any of his videos. Go up on Answering Islam. Look at his papers. They are prolific, so be careful. And you need to load and listen to the man himself. Go up on Trinity and ABN channel. I'll be on it on Wednesday night at ABN and Trinity, 3:30 to 5:30 United States Eastern time. I'll be doing a debate with Edip Yüksel there. If you want to see the debate on the Quran, on these manuscripts, you can see the debate that's going to happen there. That's a good treasure trove of a lot of stuff that Sam Shamoun and David Wood have done. It's also a great place for James White. Those of us on my team, we have Beth Grove and we have Hatun Tash, and we also have Sarah Foster, 3 dynamic women. I don't know why God has blessed me with 3 of the best women I could find. I'm leaving Fander Apologetics, Center of Apologetics, to have them run it. Watch and see what they do on ABN. Look and see what they do on the Trinity channel. Go up on Fander Films and look at our films. Just take a look. We have over 100 films up there. We're adding almost every week. We have some amazing films done with Muslims in our face. They're at Speaker's Corner. We're now filming every Sunday at Speaker's Corner. There could be hundreds of Muslims there, and they're all yelling at us at once. Now we're filming that, recording it, putting it up on YouTube. Take a look at that, because that will show you the newest material that's come out. We've just done a great film on slavery of Islam. Over 12,000 have watched that. Muslims do not like it. We've just filmed one on the Sunnah. What the Sunnah says, is it relevant for today? We've looked at the Sharia law. Is it relevant today? Because we have a mayor here who is now a Muslim, Sadiq Khan, who says that the Sharia law is compatible with British law. So we took that to pieces 2 weeks ago, just looking at the Quran, looking at the Hadith, looking at the 4 schools of law, the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Shafi, the Maliki school, and then looking at modern clerics and how they apply it today, to show it has nothing to do with British law. This week, we're going to do apostasy. We're going to do it tomorrow. Pray for us that we get through it. We're going to film it. That's all going to go up. So we have lots of new material. This material on Mecca is yet to go up yet. We have yet to do that at Speaker's Corner. That's going to be done before I leave. We're going to confront the Mecca. We're going to confront the Qibla, and we're certainly going to confront the Quran. Then we're going to get to the manuscript evidence. So hold on. There's an awful lot yet more to do. You have an awful lot yet more to learn. I would suggest learn as much as you can about Islam, but make sure you go back and ask the historical questions. There are other people that are doing this kind of material. Brian Marion is doing a great job in South Africa. Hi, Brian, if you're there. I know you come onto this chat time sometimes. Dr. Bernie Powers out of Australia is doing an amazing job in Australia. Samuel Green is another one that's doing an amazing job in Australia. Any of these people who are writing, who are doing debates, look at their debates, follow them. Of course, my good friend Tony Costa out of Canada in Toronto, amazing guy. This guy just goes from strength to strength, and he has been a thorn in the side of Shabir Ali. I think he's done at least 11 or 12 debates. And then, of course, John McClatchy. Anything that John McClatchy does or says, follow it, grab it, go with it. He is another eidetic memory guy, and I'm so glad you have this chat here, because you're getting, looks like 30 to 40 people that are listening even tonight. I know you've got up to as many as 60. Good stuff, John. If I would say that anybody, or Jehu, if you have any need, just there's all kinds of material up there. And then find your Muslim. Go up to your first Muslim. Listen, we have 1 million of them right here in London. And just say 2 things. Just say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that the Bible is the Word of God. Do you have an opinion? And see what happens. And I would suggest if you say those 2 things, you may have a discussion that will go to 3 to 4 hours. And they will start taking and forcing you to go back to Jesus and to the Bible. And I can't think of 2 things you would rather defend. I can't think of 2 things that you should be defending than Jesus and the Bible. Try that out. See what happens. Come on, look at the material that's online. Go to Answering Islam. I think it's 35,000 pages that are there. Read the material. There's almost it should be every question you have will be answered there. And then come on this blog every Saturday night and get the answers from John and his cohorts. God bless you, Jehu. I hope it goes well with you.
Thank you, Jay. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Stokey says, isn't the Christian faith dependent on oral tradition to some extent, to much lesser extent than Islam? How did the Christian oral tradition counter the Chinese whisperers' propensity of Islam couldn't or hasn't? Thank you.
Very good question. What's his name?
Stokey.
Okay, that's a new one. Okay, question. I would say yes, there is oral tradition that we're based on for the New Testament, because certainly if you look at the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they were written within, I would suggest within 30 to 40 years. John would have been written within 60 years of Christ's death. The letters of Paul would have been within 15 to 25 years of Christ's death. So before 62 AD when he was finally killed. But certainly the great thing about it is that they were oral tradition, but they were immediately read by the disciples. Luke is probably the best one. Look what Luke does at the beginning of Luke and the beginning of Acts. He says, "O Theophilus, I've taken it upon myself to write what you have told me." Who's he talking to? He's talking to the disciples who knew Jesus, because Luke never knew Jesus. He's writing everything that they tell him, and he's basically putting out a fleece to them. I'm writing your testimony. You are the ones that saw him. You are the ones that heard him. Therefore, correct me if I'm wrong. That's why it's brilliant to know that even though 2 of them were eyewitnesses, the other 2 got it from the eyewitnesses. They were written while the eyewitnesses were still living. Before before Jerusalem was sacked in 70 AD, you have all 3, plus the book of Acts, plus the letters of Paul, all written. John would have been later. Revelation maybe later as well. But certainly we have the majority part of the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and the best book on the history, written between 52 and 62 AD, the book of Acts. So all of that was there, accessible to the church. And that's why any one of the disciples could have stood up and says, that's wrong, you've got that wrong, you've got that. I think there would have been all kinds of corrections. The fact that it doesn't need to be corrected. The fact that there are no contradictions. The fact that if you look at every one of the four Gospels, I remember back in 1997 when I debated Shabir Ali at Birmingham University in 1997. You can tell how old I am. Look at my gray hair. He handed me a booklet called 101 Clear Contradictions of the Bible. Now, I couldn't answer all 101 clear contradictions of the Bible, but I went back, and for three of my friends, we took a year, came back in 1998. I debated him at Leicester University. I handed him the same book, 101 cleared up contradictions of the Bible. There are no contradictions that we can find. And what Shabir Ali did, or whoever put that booklet together did, is he did not look at the next verse. He didn't look at the next chapter. Sometimes he didn't understand the Greek, or he didn't understand the context. He didn't understand what the author was trying to say. And he made basically 19 mistakes. And we looked at every one of those 19 mistakes. And then we unpacked it for him. Now, we have that up on our website, on our Fander website. You can go pull it down, 101 cleared up contradictions of the Bible. The great thing about it is if there were any contradictions, the early church would have said something about it. They would have demanded it be changed. If the dates were wrong, if the person was wrong, if the place was wrong, if the event was wrong, names, dates, place, and events, in any of those four areas, if anything was incorrect, the early church would have got it, would have confronted it, and would have made sure that it was changed. That's why I can trust it.
Great. Is that all you have time for?
I can go for another 10 minutes. Then I'm being called over here.
Oh, okay. Let's see. What do we have? Trying to find relevant questions. All of them are relevant to the topic. Roger. Sorry?
You have a question.
Do I have a question?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
You're the only one I know that has no question because he has all the answers. God bless you.
Roger had an interesting question. He says, what would be the advantage of creating a legend of the prophet raping Aisha? If that was fictional, how does it serve to advance Muhammad's reputation as a prophet?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I'm not sure which of the scholar that Hotting said. Why would you have all these terrible stories about a prophet if you're just making him up? The problem is, you got to remember that the kahins are the ones that were their transmitters. The kahins were the storytellers. And in the context of the 9th century, someone who had many wives, someone who would be attractive and who would be able to control and maintain a 7-year-old, which was perfectly natural in that time and setting. It's not natural today. It's not relevant for today. But in that context, it was relevant. And the fact that the parents willingly gave their daughter to Muhammad, and that even when she was 9 years old, when she was going to go and have it consummated, she was outside playing with her dolls. She would then walk through the room and they all ululate. The women would all ululate in praise of her as she was walking to the bedroom. This is totally normal in a 9th century environment, but it's not normal today. And that's why we are appalled and say, why would you have stories like this that are so appalling? Because we're putting 21st century standards onto a 9th century environment. I've asked the question, why would a prophet say in Surah 4, Ayah 3, that you can only have up to 4 wives, and yet he has 12? And the answer is very clear. A man who could have that many wives, above and beyond the 4 that he prescribed for everybody else, shows not only his stature, but also the fact that he was worthy of it. The fact, if you look at the stories, story after story after story about how he could take 40 women in one night, and that again elevates him as a prophet. These are all embellishments of the man, the place, the warrior, and everything else. He's the wisest, the greatest husband, the greatest lover, the greatest warrior, the greatest in everything. That's what you do with embellishment. That's what you do with oral tradition. That's what the storytellers would give you. And that's why by the time it's written down in the 9th century, there's nothing wrong with Muhammad. And everything about him is so embellished, so enhanced, that he's appalling to us in the 21st century because we're looking at him through biblical eyes. And the Western world sees everything through our Judeo-Christian eyes, thank God. And we see a 53-year-old man bedding down a 9-year-old girl as wrong, but not in the 9th century. That was seen. That's what a prophet would do. That's what a great man of God would do. That's what a leader of men would do. He would show his virility. The problem I have is you would think that if he was so virile, why couldn't he produce a male heir with all those wives? And also, and I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes in saying this, but I say from Speaker's Corner all the time, And I say, it's fascinating to me that these stories do seem to enhance him, but the very thing that should be the most enhancing is the fact that he could not produce one male heir. All he could produce was 4 females. And the 2 that he did produce, the 2 male heirs that he did produce, died at a very young age. So I would suggest that we need to make sure that we're looking at the Muhammad of faith, the Muhammad of the 9th and 10th century, not the Muhammad of the 21st century.
I think it was actually 9 women that he visited in one night, because it says in Sahih Bukhari that he would go and visit each of his 9 wives in one night. And then the question that's asked is, will Muhammad have the strength for it? Just in case you thought it meant going to say goodnight or to have coffee with them. And then it says,
40 women one night. That's what's amazing.
And then it says, Muhammad has a strength of 30 men. So
so that sounds awful and that sounds terrible. But for a 9th century environment, that would be a huge enhancement of his character and his person, and of course as a leader. Not a model for today, but certainly a model from the 9th century. Place him in the century he's been written, not even the 7th century, because I would suggest in the 7th century, this was not exactly, and this is, Beth Grove on our team is writing about Khadija versus Aisha, and we're going to do this from the ladder in about another week or two. If you look at Khadija and Aisha, you will see that Khadija actually fits much more of a woman of today. Khadija had her own wealth, she had her own caravans, she employed Muhammad. As long as she was married to him, he could not marry another man. She demanded a monogamous relationship. She had control over him. She didn't have to wear the hijab. Everything about Khadija is what we want to see today. And yet Muslims call that Jahiliyyah, which is the age of ignorance. It's when she dies, then only when she dies, that Muhammad then is able to take all the other wives. And more than that, eradicate the very freedoms that Khadija had. So I would suggest that even the 7th century Nabatean environment from which Islam comes out of, there is a much more free, much more, I would say, closer to our 21st century environment than what we see Islam then became. Because Aisha, who represents the Islam of Muhammad, the Islam of Muhammad of faith, then becomes restricted. She gets beaten by her husband. Though she is able to lead men to war, she is taken when she was 9 years old and on. And then you see from that time, there's a reduction. They now have to wear not just the hijab, they have to wear the chador, and no other men can see them. They have to remain behind a veil even in their own homes. So no other men can marry them. So you can see this reduction of the freedoms they had in the Jahiliyyah period to the time of Muhammad. And I would suggest that even the Muhammad that we're seeing today, that's probably a 9th century Muhammad, not a 7th century Nabatean Muhammad.
An anonymous viewer says, according to the classical narrative, didn't Muhammad authorize the writings of the Quran to his personal secretary Zayd, which was shorter than the Hafsa Quran, because Abu Bakr ordered Zayd to collect and compile other Quran verses into it?
Okay, I understand the first part. I didn't understand the second part, but let me see if I got it right. Zayd ibn Thabit is the secretary of Muhammad. That's we know from the tradition. He is commissioned not by Muhammad, because Muhammad, remember, didn't commission anybody to write anything down. They would write it on stones. They would write it on leaves, on bark. They would memorize it on bone. There's a very famous bone, supposedly, that has the original Quranic writing in I think it's in Turkey. And then Abu Bakr, 2 years after Muhammad died, had people come to him and say many of those who had memorized it were died in the Battle of Yamama. That's why he then took Zayd ibn Thabit, commissioned him to then write down the Quran. And he goes to these stones, bones, and bark, and to the memory of the men who had existed, and then he compiled it. And he said, there's this famous reference there where it says that he had to go from in Surah, Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509, where there was one verse that he remembered, but he had to find 2 witnesses. So he had to go all over to find one other person that knew this verse. And when he found it, then he knew that he could put it into the Quran. Now that was given to Hafsa. She put it under her bed according to tradition, and that remained there for about 20 years, till about 652. In 652, then, because of the many other Qurans that were proliferating, the many other renditions, Uthman then had Zayd ibn Thabit once again come and with 4 friends take the Hafsa's copy that had been retained by Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad, and then rewrite that Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. That's what, again, Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509 and 510.
What do you think, Jay, of the Hadith traditions which speak of parts of the Quran which have been lost, entire verses, entire sections of chapters, entire chapters even, that have been lost? like in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which are very authoritative hadith traditions, which suggests to me that in the 9th and 10th centuries, when these hadith traditions were being compiled, that there was dispute and controversy over what should have been in the Quran, hence the need for those traditions to be produced. What do you think that says about the state of the Quran at the time of the compiling of these hadith collections?
Yeah, so you're saying, what about the 9th century, late 9th century? Because you're talking about 850 to 870. That's the first of the compilation of the hadith.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they had all the, and it's not just that they were lost, they were forgotten, some were changed. One was, even part of the Quran was eaten by a goat. Some of it, even Aisha has to come and dispute of it. The verse on Rajam, which is, and Umar complains about the fact that what are we going to say about the adultery, because we stoned the adulterers, the prophet stoned the adulterers after him. What are they going to say when they read the Quran today? Because now it's been changed to 100 lashes, and that's what it is in Surah 24, Ayah 2. So there's all these reference after reference after reference of forgotten, changed, deleted, accreted, and then also eaten parts of the Quran. So certainly in the 9th century, the earliest compilers had no problem that there were much of the Quran that's missing. As-Suyuti says very clear, what Quran are you talking about? The only Quran we have is that which has been retained, that which we have in our hand today. That's all we can say is the Quran that exists. So he's very clear that the Quran that existed in the 9th century was not the full Quran. It's only in the 20th century, and maybe 1800, in the 19th century, 1800s, that you start getting this. I'm sorry, it's even before that. You have Ibn Qasim in 10, so even in the 11th century, that you start getting this notion that the Quran is unchanged, that the earlier scriptures have been changed, and this idea of corruption of the earlier scriptures. That comes about 400 years later. So it's from that time on, from the 11th century, it becomes really strong in the 19th centuries, in the Indian subcontinent, especially in the debates they had there with Fander and Muir. Those debates, if you look, are all about the uncorruptedness of the Quran, how the Quran can be traced right back to the eternal tablets that exist in heaven. That starts to really proliferate in the 19th century and has become very popular in the 20th and 21st century. So it's a much more modern argument. That was not an argument in the 9th century or the 10th century or the 11th century.
But the Quran does claim that no one can change the words of Allah.
Yes, I suggest that that's true, but then what Quran are you talking about?
Right, that's true.
We're talking about something it's the corpus that doesn't even exist at the time that Quran made how that verse was written down.
That is true. Okay, should we call it tonight there?
John, thanks so much. Listen, it'd be good to do one on the Quran, where we can actually go through another PowerPoint and show what we now know about the Quran. We'll give you a date and then we'll go on that. But I want to thank everybody who's watching. I see there's 35 who are there now. And Michael, who have been staying faithfully. You guys haven't had a chance to ask any questions. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your patience as well. We've gone through an awful lot of material. I know some of it is new, and I know for the Muslims who are watching, it's been disturbing. The few that have come on, thank you for having the courage to do that. Thanks for your passion. But remember, everything we know about Islam is now open to scrutiny, and it looks like much of what we know about Islam does not follow the classical model. It looks like the Achilles heel of Islam is going to be this historical critique. We've dealt with Muhammad and the emergence of Islam today. Next is the Quran.
Well, thank you, Jay. We'll have to have you rescheduled to talk about that.
Okay. God bless you.
All right. Take care.
Here's London.